If you could step back in time just for one night and walk the decks of the Titanic beneath a sky of 1,000 stars, would you take that chance? That's exactly what we're going to do tonight. And no, this isn't James Cameron's version. There will be no Celine Dion, no floating doors, and absolutely no Leonardo DiCaprio sketching in the lounge. Instead, you'll hear the real hum of her engines beneath your feet. Feel the salt air on your skin, and stand where history itself once stood still. If you love stories that let you live inside another moment, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and keep notifications on, because what you're about to hear is just the beginning of an unforgettable voyage. The ocean at night is not a thing to be hurried. It reveals itself in layers, in vast and deliberate breaths, as though it knows that only patience can unlock its beauty. Out here, far from the last glimmer of any shore, darkness is not absence, it is a living presence. Deep and infinite, carrying the cold gleam of 1,000 stars. They hang low and sharp in the sky, their reflections scattered in fragments over the restless water. The air tastes of salt and carries the faintest trace of coal smoke drifting upward from the heart of the ship. Somewhere below, in the unseen depths of steel and machinery, the Titanic moves with a calm authority, her engines thrumming in a heartbeat that you feel more than hear, a steady pulse that joins with the endless rhythm of the waves. She is not simply traveling tonight, she is keeping a quiet appointment with the horizon, each mile a small promise kept. From a distance, she seems almost too perfect to be real. Her lights spill into the darkness in long ribbons of gold, bending and breaking with the movement of the sea. Against the deep velvet of the night sky, her four funnels stand tall and still, sending their pale plumes into the wind where they fade like breath on glass. Every line of her silhouette, from the sweep of her bow to the curve of her stern, has been drawn with such confidence that she appears less a ship than a vision made solid. Along her decks, the glow from portholes and grand windows falls across polished teak and white-painted railings, creating pools of warm light where passengers pause to look outward into the infinite dark. The sound she makes is a music of its own, the deep, unbroken murmur of engines, the softened crash of water parting at the bow, the occasional creak of wood and steel adjusting to the living sea. It is the sound of something vast, yet self-assured, moving forward with no hesitation. Step inside, and the world changes entirely. The night air gives way to a warmth that feels almost domestic, though wrapped in luxury. The corridors stretch away in quiet, their carpets soft underfoot, their walls lined with gleaming brass and carved paneling that catches and holds the lamplight in gentle halos. Somewhere far off, a door closes with a muffled click. In a nearby lounge, the low hum of conversation rises and falls, punctuated now and then by the soft laughter of someone too comfortable to notice the hour. The scent here is a delicate blend. The polish of wood, the freshness of laundered linen, a faint note of perfume carried on the coat of a passerby. And, lingering still from dinner, the ghost of roast meats and wine. All of it together creates a sense that this place exists outside of time, as if the ship has sealed itself away from the rest of the world for the duration of the voyage. On the promenade deck, the air sharpens again, but loses none of its invitation. A few late walkers make slow circuits along the rail, their footsteps quiet against the planks, their breath forming pale clouds that vanish almost as soon as they appear. The sea before them is an unbroken sweep of darkness, but it is alive with subtle movement. The rise and fall of the swells, the quick silvery flare of moonlight on a crest before it sinks again into shadow. The bow slices ahead with quiet confidence, sending a curl of white foam racing along the hull, and the vibration beneath the feet is steady, reassuring an unspoken promise that the ship knows her path. Standing here, one can feel the immense scale of the ocean, its ancient patience, and the strange comfort of being carried across it by something as solid and certain as the Titanic. For some, this night is nothing more than a pause between 2 points on a map. For others, it is a moment they will carry for the rest of their lives. In the staterooms, passengers lie awake under the soft weight of their blankets, listening to the gentle rise and fall of the ship's movement, their minds wandering to the lands that await them. Some think of the homes they have left behind, the faces they will not see for months or years. Others picture the future that draws nearer with each passing hour. In the lounges, A few conversations linger into the small hours, their participants leaning closer over the glow of shaded lamps. The sound of their voices softened by the deep carpets and the gentle clink of glasses. Below, in the warm, close air of third-class cabins, whole families sleep in stacked bunks, their dreams a mingling of memory and hope. The Titanic holds them all without distinction, each dream folded neatly into the larger journey. And beyond all of it, the decks, the cabins, the laughter, and the quiet, the ocean waits. It is not hostile, nor is it kind. It simply is, vast and indifferent, as it has been for thousands of years. Tonight it carries the Titanic forward, mile by mile, through waters so dark it seems to swallow the light, and yet so clear that the stars appear doubled. Once in the sky, and again in the depths below, the horizon has disappeared, erased by the night, leaving only the sense of endless movement through a space without boundaries. Here, in this stillness, there is a truth that every sailor knows. No moment at sea ever comes again in exactly the same way. And so, each one is precious, whether or not we notice it while it is happening. The morning of departure did not arrive with haste, but rather with the unhurried grace of something momentous taking shape. A pale veil of mist hung low over the harbor, turning cranes and masts into faint silhouettes against the dim light. The air carried a damp coolness that clung to skin and clothing, mixed with the complex scent of the sea, brine sharp and clean, underpinned by the faint musk of wet timber and the heavier temps of coal smoke drifting from a nearby tugboat. The sun, still low in the sky, seemed reluctant to break through the haze, casting everything in a muted gold. Beneath these sensations was something subtler yet, a deep, almost imperceptible vibration from the massive shape moored at the quay. The Titanic lay still, her hull a black wall rising impossibly high from the water, her name in gold catching occasional glimmers as the mist shifted. Even without movement, she exuded presence, as if the day itself revolved around her quiet readiness. The docks were alive with 1,000 small movements, each part of a greater rhythm that no single person could see in full. Porters hunched under the weight of trunks stacked taller than themselves, the wooden wheels of their carts rattling over the uneven boards. Stewards, immaculate in their uniforms, moved briskly yet without fuss, answering questions, guiding families, and checking passenger lists with quiet authority. Gulls circled above, their sharp cries piercing through the low hum of conversation and the deep, distant thud of cargo being lowered into the holds. The slap of water against the pilings marked time, steady and unchanging. Somewhere far off a ship's whistle sounded. Not the Titanic's, but another vessel announcing its own departure. A reminder that this was a living, breathing harbor where countless stories began each day. Yet none seemed as significant as the one about to unfold here. For those seeing her for the first time, the Titanic was not merely a ship. She was an apparition in steel. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, gestures slowed, and eyes tilted upward, tracing her from waterline to rail, to the elegant rise of her superstructure, to the 4 buff-colored funnels standing like pillars against the misted sky. The sheer scale was difficult to absorb in a single glance, which demanded a slow taking in, the way one might approach a cathedral. Children pulled impatiently at their parents' hands, their questions tumbling out faster than answers could come. Older men folded their arms and shook their heads with the quiet awe of those who thought they had seen it all. Women in fine coats leaned toward one another, imagining the splendor inside, the polished wood, the sparkling chandeliers, the promise of meals and music and comfort that seemed to float in the air like an unspoken vow. She needed no movement to command the day. Her stillness was a kind of power. Near the base of the gangways, human moments unfolded in dozens of small, unrepeatable scenes. Friends clasped hands not simply as a formality, but in a kind of exchange, a warm, silent passing of trust and memory. Some held on longer than custom allowed, fingers tightening for an extra beat before letting go. Couples stood close, their foreheads nearly touching, whispering final words meant for no one else, words already fraying in the wind. Children clung to skirts or sleeves, uncertain whether to smile or to cry. Bursts of laughter erupted here and there, the kind that comes from nerves and the strangeness of goodbyes. And above all, there was the constant threat of waving, a slow, repetitive motion that seemed almost ceremonial, the language of departure shared between those staying and those going. The gangways themselves were more than simple ramps. They were liminal spaces, thresholds between the known and the unknown. Each footstep upon them was a quiet act of surrender, leaving the grit and clamor of the dock for the ordered calm of the ship. As passengers advanced, the soundscape shifted. The clang and cry of the harbor faded, placed by the subdued hum of the vessel's inner life. A faint vibration could be felt through the soles of one's shoes, as though the Titanic herself was breathing beneath the skin of the deck. The scent changed too, still salt air, but now mingled with the faint sweetness of varnished wood. The dry, clean smell of linen, the ghost of tobacco lingering from a steward's passing. Men in uniform stood ready to guide and direct, their quiet efficiency reinforcing the sense that from this point forward, every detail would be managed, every moment smoothed into place. First-class reception rooms were not merely spaces, they were introductions, carefully staged to assure new arrivals of the ship's refinement. Paneling in deep honeyed tones reflected light in soft ripples, its surface polished to a glow that seemed to hold warmth. The air carried the faint perfume of fresh flowers, lilies and roses arranged in vases, tall enough to catch the eye from across the room. Carpets thick underfoot muffled conversation into an intimate murmur, punctuated only by the slow tick of an ornate clock. Yes. Passengers lingered here not only to admire, but to orient themselves, their voices low, their movements deliberate, as though already adapting to the ship's quiet elegance. Second-class quarters held their own charm, a simpler brightness, accented by well-kept finishes and a certain honest neatness. Brass railings shone where hands passed, the painted walls gleamed clean, and sunlight pooled through open promenade doors, carrying with it the mingled sense of sea air and distant land. Families moved in compact groups, pausing to test a bench or glance out at the dock one final time. Conversations here were light, often practical, as people adjusted coats, arranged luggage, or pointed out features of the ship to companions. The air felt open, expectant, touched with the mild excitement of settling into a place that would soon feel like home. Third-class spaces pulsed with life, an atmosphere almost celebratory, though threaded with nerves. In the communal rooms, voices rose and fell in a dozen dialects, the sound overlapping into a single, bustling harmony. Children darted through the spaces, their laughter ringing against the wooden walls. The smell of freshly baked bread drifted from somewhere unseen, mingling with the sharper temps of wool drying from the morning's mist and the faint metallic scent of new fittings. Luggage, marked with chalked numbers and letters, lay in careful piles along the walls. Many passengers wore the expression of those who were not simply traveling, stepping into a new life, an awareness that this voyage was more than miles across water. It was miles across fate itself. On the dock, the final preparations played out in deliberate choreography. Crates thudded softly as they were stacked and secured, barrels rolled into place with a low, hollow rhythm. The massive mooring ropes, taut as bowstrings, groaned against their posts, fibers stretching under strain. The crowd, sensing the nearness of departure, pressed closer to the edge of the quay, leaning forward as though proximity could delay the inevitable. Above, flags rippled sharply in the wind, their colors bright against the now lifting mist. Then came the Titanic's whistle, a deep, resonant note that rolled through the harbor, vibrating in the chest, carried outward across water and into the very bones of those present. It was less a sound than an announcement, a summons that marked the precise moment when waiting became leaving. The release of the mooring ropes was not a quick or casual act, it was a deliberate ritual, heavy with the knowledge that each movement carried irreversible consequence. Men in dark coats leaned over the edge of the deck, their gloved hands working with steady precision to ease the massive coiled lengths of hemp from the iron bollards below. The ropes, thick and rough as ancient tree roots, hissed faintly as they slid over metal, releasing drops of harbor water that splashed back into the churning surface. Each coil laid on the deck was a quiet confirmation that the ship's bond to the shore was loosening, thread by thread. Beneath the hull, the screws stirred the water into pale turbulence, the foam spreading outward in widening spirals. At first the shift was imperceptible, a mere suggestion beneath the feet. But then a subtle widening appeared between the black flank of the ship and the solid, weathered timbers of the quay. Hands on shore reached instinctively toward that gap, some in playful waves, others in still, lingering gestures meant to hold the heart in place. Above, passengers leaned forward into the cool air, responding with their own movements, enthusiastic sweeps of hats, slower nods of farewell, or simply hands pressed against the railing, as though feeling the pulse of departure through the steel. As the Titanic eased forward, the city began to retreat not in a single moment, but in countless small diminishments. The bold outlines of warehouses softened into blocks of shadow, their colors blurring into the pale mist that still clung in pockets along the waterfront. The sharper notes of the harbor, the bark of a dog, the clatter of a cartwheel grew faint, dissolving into the steady, underlying churn of water against steel. On deck, passengers leaned over the rails, their coats drawn close against a wind that carried both the salt of the open sea and the faint, almost imagined scent of the land they were leaving. Some stood in stillness, eyes fixed on the dwindling skyline, as if they might capture and store every detail for the years ahead. Others turned inward, speaking softly to companions, their voices carrying that curious blend of excitement and wistfulness that marks the crossing from one chapter of life into another. The city, for its part, offered no farewell. It simply diminished into distance, its presence folding into the past as naturally as the tide slides back from the shore. The channel ahead opened in a broad, slow arc, the water deepening to a darker, fuller blue as the ship moved steadily toward the open sea. Gulls wheeled in restless patterns overhead, their white wings flashing bright in the sun before tilting into shadow again. For a time they kept pace, riding the invisible currents trailing in the ship's wake, their cries sharp and carrying above the steady hum of the engines. One by one, they began to turn back, drawn toward the familiar safety of the harbor's edge. Their voices thinned in the air until all that remained was the muted roar of the sea slipping past the hull and the faint creak of the ship's timbers adjusting to the unbroken rhythm of forward motion. Sunlight poured unobstructed now, catching the undulating surface of the water and scattering light in patterns that slid across the white lifeboats above and traced thin, trembling lines of brightness along the steel rails. It felt as if the ship had crossed an invisible border, one that separated the protected land-bound world from the vast open breadth of the ocean. Life on deck began to take on its first quiet arrangements. Passengers who had claimed deck chairs leaned back against the padded canvas, tucking wool rugs over their knees, their faces tilted alternately toward the sea ahead and the shrinking shadow of land behind. The wind carried a crisp edge, enough to bring color to cheeks and to prompt the subtle pull of collars higher around the neck. Some strolled the promenade in measured steps, their fingers brushing along the smooth, varnished rail as they paused to watch the bow slice through the waves with effortless grace. Inside, in lounges and saloons, the first cups of tea and coffee were poured, the delicate clink of china punctuating low threads of conversation. The movement of the ship, though gentle, was enough to make the liquid in each cup tremble faintly, a reminder that everything aboard was now part of a living, moving whole. Children pressed their noses to windows, tracing the bright white churn of the wake as it stretched into the distance, their voices rising in delighted observation before fading again into the soft fabric of shipboard life. By the time the last smudge of coastline had vanished entirely, the Titanic had settled into a motion that was both immense and subtle, a vast momentum that the body quickly learned to match without conscious effort. The deck beneath one's feet seemed alive, rising and falling in a slow, patient rhythm that suggested both strength and inevitability. Overhead, the flags snapped sharply in the wind, their colors bright against the boundless sweep of blue sky. Somewhere forward, a ship's bell chimed, its note clear and deliberate, marking an hour that felt untethered from the hurried timekeeping of the shore. The air was different here, cleaner, sharper, and carrying with it a faint taste of distance. Conversations drifted into more reflective currents, the initial excitement softening into the steady awareness that the world of land was behind them now, replaced entirely by the endless living surface of the sea. And so the departure, which had begun as a series of actions and exchanges on shore, transformed into a state of being. The land no longer stood behind them as something visible. It existed only as memory, already beginning to soften at the edges. In its place lay the horizon, vast, unbroken, and alive with the possibilities of days yet to come. The ocean stretched in every direction, its surface restless, but not unkind, its color shifting with the passing clouds. The air itself seemed to carry a shared understanding among the passengers, even between strangers, that they had stepped into a story whose course could not be fully known, but whose beginning they had just witnessed together. It was a beginning wrapped in the sound of water against steel, in the subtle sway beneath the feet, and in the quiet thrill of moving forward into the unknown. Here, in this moment, the Titanic was not simply a vessel. She was the keeper of hundreds of private hopes, carrying them all toward whatever lay beyond the horizon. The first hours at sea did not rush upon the passengers. They unfolded with the careful, deliberate grace of a scene meant to be savored. The Titanic's movement was steady, confident, each turn of her propellers pressing her farther into the open waters with the unbroken rhythm of a living heartbeat. The sky still carried the softened hues of morning, pale golds and silvers that melted into the distant horizon, and the air was cool enough to prickle the skin without biting. Along the railings, clusters of passengers leaned forward, gazing at the ship's white wake as it spread behind them like a ribbon of foam, its restless, shifting edges catching the sun in fleeting flashes. For a long while, they said little. The sight alone was enough. The realization that each passing minute placed more sea between them and the land they had left behind, and that this line of churning water was their only visible tether to it. As the miles stretched outward, the air itself began to change, shedding the last traces of the harbor. The mixed scents of coal smoke, damp rope, and tar thinned until all that remained was the clean, invigorating breath of the open sea. It carried with it a faint saltiness, sharp yet refreshing, that seemed to clear the mind and settle the heart. The soundscape shifted as well. The insistent cries of the gulls grew fainter with each passing minute until they disappeared entirely, replaced by the constant soothing rush of water along the hull. This new sound was endless yet never monotonous. It rose and fell in gentle variations, a reminder of the sea's vast patience. For some aboard, the change brought an almost physical lightness, as if a weight they had not known they carried had been left behind with the fading shore. The decks slowly began to reveal their own patterns of life. Stewards, their uniforms immaculate, moved with an efficient ease, appearing and disappearing like clockwork as they guided lost passengers, delivered messages, or answered the same questions for the 10th time that morning without losing their composure. Passengers explored their floating world, their steps slowing as they discovered long stretches of promenade, where the wind lifted scarves and sent the brims of hats fluttering. Some walked purposefully toward the bow to feel the rush of air meet them head-on, while others lingered near the stern, watching the ship's wake diminish into the horizon, its line trembling and folding back into the deep. Groups formed naturally, drawn together by shared amazement or curiosity, and then dissolved again, leaving each person to wander into another small pocket of discovery. Stepping inside from the promenade was like crossing into another realm. The cool, invigorating breath of the sea gave way to the warm, still air of the Titanic's interiors, where every detail seemed designed to soothe the senses. In the first-class lounges, morning light poured through tall windows, its brightness tempered by rich draperies and the deep tones of wood paneling polished to a gentle sheen. The air carried faint scents of beeswax, fresh flowers, and brewing coffee, each note blending into the next. Chairs were angled for conversation, but also for the best view of the passing water, as though no wall could fully contain the voyage. In second class, the atmosphere was simpler, but no less inviting. White-painted walls gleamed, the brass railings caught the light, and the spaces felt open and honest, warmed by the easy flow of voices. Even in third class, where plain wooden benches and tables spoke of utility, there was a neatness and care that suggested a kind of respect for the journey itself. Breakfast marked the first communal gathering of the day, and it unfolded like the slow rising of a gentle tide, each moment building quietly upon the last. In first class, the gleam of silver cutlery caught the light as waiters moved with choreographed precision. balancing trays laden with steaming dishes, kippers' eggs, fresh rolls stacked in silver baskets, each plate set down with quiet ceremony. Conversation began softly, as though the richness of the surroundings demanded a certain reverence. Before warming into polite exchanges over the quality of the coffee or the smoothness of the butter, in second class, the room was bright with natural light and the hum of contentment. Porridge steamed in wide bowls, fresh bread was passed hand to hand, and now and then a burst of laughter rang out, unburdened by formality. Even in third class, where the fare was simpler, thick slices of bread, mugs of tea, there was a palpable warmth in the air, born of shared purpose and the strange camaraderie that springs up between those traveling toward the same unknown. Across all three classes, the rhythm of the ship could be felt beneath the tables, steady pulse that reminded everyone, no matter their station, that they were moving forward together. When the meals ended, the promenades became rivers of slow-moving figures, each with their own private current of thought. Couples walked arm in arm, leaning into the wind that teased at their clothing, pausing now and again to point out the shimmer of sunlight sliding across the waves. Parents bent low to lift children onto the rails, holding them steady as they peered down into the foam, their faces lit with awe at the sheer immensity of it all. Older passengers, their hands clasped behind their backs, moved at a measured pace, stopping at intervals to simply breathe the salt air and take in the endless horizon. Every so often, a stranger's eyes would meet another's. A brief smile would pass between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were sharing not just a voyage, but a rare and fleeting chapter of life. There were pauses in the day when the entire ship seemed to exhale, when the wind softened and the ocean's surface smoothed into something like liquid glass. In those suspended moments, it was as if time itself loosened its grip. Voices quieted of their own accord, footsteps slowed to a gentle rhythm, and the great ship's deck became not just a place of passage, but a sanctuary. Passengers leaned against the rails with the unhurried ease of people who knew there was nowhere they needed to be, but here, now. Some stared long into the horizon, their eyes tracing that unbroken seam between sea and sky, searching for meaning in its unwavering line. Others seemed to turn inward, allowing thoughts to unfurl, a father recalling the warmth of a hand he had not held in years, a young woman rehearsing in her mind the moment she would step onto a new shore, a child tilting their head to listen for sounds hidden beneath the waves, certain they might hear the slow, secret music of the ocean's depths. The air itself seemed to cradle these thoughts, as if the ship were holding each passenger in a shared, unspoken reverie. Deep within the Titanic's steel heart, far below the polish and light of her upper decks, the engines worked with the tireless discipline of giants. Their low, resonant thrum was not merely a sound, but a presence. It trembled faintly through the soles of shoes, traced a subtle vibration along the rails, and gave a soft, almost imperceptible pulse to the very air. It was the heartbeat of the voyage, steady, unyielding, as constant as the horizon itself. In the lounges, a teacup on its saucer might tremble just enough to catch the eye, a gentle reminder of the massive forces in motion below. Standing alone on deck, one could almost imagine the ship breathing, her lungs drawing in the cold, salted air and exhaling in long, measured sighs, her vast body carrying its human cargo forward with both strength and grace. This quiet power seemed to invite trust, the kind of trust one offers without realizing, simply because the rhythm never falters. The sea answered in its own language, weaving a reply from sounds and movements as old as time. The slap of the waves against the hull was a deep, deliberate percussion, its beat steady and patient. Above it, the hiss of foam curled away from the bow, dissolving into air like whispers carried off by the wind. Beneath it all, far below sight, there was a deeper groan, the low voice of water parting around the ship's immense body. These sounds layered themselves into the life aboard, until they were no longer noticed as separate. They became part of the background hum of existence at sea. To stand at the rail was to stand at the threshold between two worlds, watching and listening to an eternal conversation between steel and water, each answering the other in a language without words, without end. Inside, the public rooms began to take on a settled warmth, as though they, too, had adjusted to the rhythm of the journey. The glow of polished wood, the muted gleam of brass, and the faint scent of beeswax gave them a sense of permanence, as if they had always existed here, floating above the endless water. Conversations found their own steady pace. Quiet games of cards played in comfortable silence, gentle laughter at a remembered story, the soft scratch of pen on paper as letters home were begun. Now and again, eyes would drift toward the portholes, drawn by the hypnotic slide of the sea beyond. That endless moving blue seemed to listen, to bear witness to every hope, every memory voiced within these walls. Children continued to shape their own territories aboard, claiming hidden corners and sheltered stretches of deck as their private domains. Their laughter spilled into the air like bright ribbons, twisting away on the breeze before fading into the ship's wider hum. Some knelt to count the rivets along the rail. Others peered down at the lifeboats and tried to guess how high above the sea they were. Their games were simple but absorbing. Races along short deck lengths, imaginary adventures played out in the shadow of the towering funnels. Parents watched from a distance, some leaning against the rail. Others seated with a book open but unread, their eyes always lifting to follow a familiar voice. The ship seemed both boundless and safe, a rare combination that allowed even the most protective to grant a measure of freedom. By midday, the light had grown almost crystalline, sharpening every line of the ship until she seemed newly made. The great funnels rose like painted towers, their warm buff tones glowing in the sun, their shadows drawing slow-moving arcs across the deck with the ship's gentle sway. The sea glittered in 1,000 fragments of silver and sapphire, each crest rising with a grace that felt rehearsed. As if the ocean had been waiting to show its calmest face. Passengers slowed without realizing, their voices softening, as though in respect for the clarity of the day. The air was cool but not biting, and every breath carried with it the taste of salt and distance. It was a kind of perfection that asked nothing more than to be noticed. The Titanic herself seemed to settle into this rhythm, her early vigor giving way to a smoother, almost effortless glide. Her corridors, once places to pass through quickly, became familiar routes, each turn revealing a sight now known, but no less pleasing. The promenades, with their long views and steady breezes, took on the feel of favorite walks in a familiar neighborhood. Passengers began to recognize one another, a nod here, a polite word there, as small threads of community began to weave themselves through the vastness of the ship. This growing familiarity made her size feel less overwhelming, not smaller, but more navigable, more like a city one could learn by heart. And yet, even with this ease settling in, there remained an unspoken awareness that they were being carried ever deeper into a place untouched by land. The horizon was unbroken in every direction, a perfect line where the world seemed to fold into itself. It called to each person differently. To some, it promised opportunity. To others, it whispered of the unknown, with a voice that was both thrilling and humbling. That line, steady and patient, was always there. Whether glimpsed from the warmth of a saloon, or from the cold edge of the forward deck, a reminder that they were in the midst of something vast, unalterable, and beyond their control. Beneath the comfort and camaraderie, beneath the polished wood and the shining brass, the true voice of the voyage could be felt, a steady murmur that had nothing to do with conversation or music. It was the sound of progress, of miles unspooling under the keel, of a path being drawn invisibly across the map of the world. In that sound was a kind of intimacy, as if the sea itself cradled the ship and all aboard in great, tireless hands. And within every passenger, whether they knew it or not, there was a private hope being carried forward, a dream of arrival, of change, of stepping into a future not yet written, but already moving toward them with the slow inevitability of the tide. The morning unfolded like the turning of a vast, delicate page, each moment sliding seamlessly into the next without haste or urgency. The light, no longer the thin silver of dawn, had warmed into a soft gold that draped itself across the decks, catching in the curves of railings and the edges of polished brass. It was the kind of light that did not merely illuminate, but seemed to settle into every surface, bringing out the quiet depth of the ship's woodwork and the richness of the fabrics within her lounges. On deck, shadows lengthened slowly, stretching toward the railings in graceful arcs as the Titanic's steady forward motion shifted the sun's angle. The wind, though still carrying the faint chill of the Atlantic, had softened to a gentle caress. brushing the faces of those who walked the promenade, lifting loose strands of hair and tugging lightly at coat hems. There was a sense, shared unconsciously among the passengers, that this was not simply another morning, but the first real step into the life of the voyage, a step to be taken with intention and quiet reverence. The crew moved through these hours with an unbroken rhythm, each man and woman a thread in the great tapestry of order and care that held the Titanic together. Their uniforms were immaculate, whites that seemed to glow in the sunlight, dark blues that caught the sheen of the sea's reflection. Even the simplest actions, the adjustment of a lifeboat's ropes, the polishing of a brass hinge, the quiet exchange of a few words between officers, were performed with the deliberate precision of ritual. The sound of boots meeting the deck planks blended seamlessly with the constant undertone of the ship's engines, forming a steady beat beneath the shifting music of the ocean. Passengers watched them in passing, some with the mild curiosity of onlookers, others with the deeper, more private comfort of knowing that these were the guardians of their safety, the keepers of the vessel's steady heart. In the first-class sections, the mood was one of unhurried luxury, an atmosphere where time seemed to stretch and bend at the will of its occupants. Along the promenade, rows of deck chairs stood neatly aligned, each draped with a warm plaid blanket to guard against the lingering chill. Passengers reclined with books resting lightly in their hands, though many found themselves gazing not at the pages but out over the glittering expanse of water, their eyes drawn by the hypnotic rhythm of the waves. Small groups formed near the railings, their voices hushed, as though instinctively keeping the sea's grandeur intact. The steward passed among them with a silver tray, the cups of tea clinking softly in their saucers, the faint aroma of bergamot curling into the air and mingling with the sharper scent of salt. Every detail, the gleam of sunlight on the water, the muted murmur of conversation, the warmth of the tea between one's hands, seemed to belong not just to the day, but to the memory of it. The second-class areas, though less lavish, possessed their own quiet dignity, a kind of warmth born from familiarity rather than grandeur. Families lingered on the promenades, the boards beneath their feet creaking softly with each gentle rise and fall of the ship. Parents pointed toward the horizon, tracing invisible lines with their fingers to indicate where they imagined distant lands might be, while children leaned dangerously far over the rails to watch the foaming white trail that stretched endlessly behind them. Inside the second-class library, the air was a mixture of faintly musty paper and the clean scent of sunlight on polished wood. Tall windows admitted generous streams of daylight, turning the space into a calm retreat from the crisp wind outside. A middle-aged man sat at one of the writing tables, his hand moving slowly across the page, pausing now and again to glance upward as if searching the horizon for the right word. Two women nearby shared a worn novel, their voices dipping into whispers, occasionally brightened by quiet bursts of laughter that drew no glances of disapproval. For here, comfort was found in the ease of company rather than the stiffness of formality. In third class, the energy was vibrant, alive with the hum of possibility. The common rooms, though plain and simply furnished, felt full to bursting with conversation. Here the air was touched more strongly by the sharp temps of salt from the sea and the faint, comforting aroma of bread from the galley. On the open decks, groups gathered to swap stories, tales of villages left behind, of family members already waiting across the ocean, of dreams still too fragile to share above a murmur. Children darted between adults, their voices shrill with excitement as they invented games that wove between the benches and along the railings. The wind seemed to play along, tugging at scarves, pressing against coats, ruffling hair, adding its own restless note to the chorus of voices and laughter. Every smile, every eager glance toward the endless horizon carried within it the weight of hope, the kind that could make the very air feel lighter. By now, the Titanic's motion had settled into a perfect equilibrium, steady, almost imperceptible sway that one felt more in the rhythm of their body than in conscious thought. Each step across the deck had its own gentle rise and fall, like walking to the pulse of a great sleeping creature. The soundscape, too, shifted into something that passengers no longer actively noticed. The whisper of the wind threading through the rigging, the constant but distant rumble of the engines, the occasional creak of timber, or soft metallic sigh of the ship adjusting to the sea's contours. These sounds were no longer interruptions. They were the texture of life aboard, the oral proof that the ship was not simply carrying them forward, but was alive in her own way, conversing with the ocean beneath her. There were times when life aboard slowed into moments, so still they felt like a pause in time itself. A young woman leaned against the rail, her gloved hands gripping the cool metal as her eyes followed the lazy rise and fall of the waves. She thought not of where she was going, nor of what she had left behind, but simply of the rhythm before her, the eternal back and forth that seemed as unhurried as it was unchanging. A man sat on a bench in the lee of a lifeboat, his hat tipped forward over his eyes, listening to the way the wind softened as it passed around the ship's great hull. In these instants, the Titanic seemed less like a machine and more like a place, a floating world suspended between one shore and another, untethered except for the invisible thread of her own steady progress. The sea responded to this calm with a face of near perfection. Its surface shimmered beneath the late morning sun, each swell carrying a scatter of light like molten silver. The horizon held steady, a sharp, unwavering line where sky met water in perfect symmetry. Far below, the wake churned and frothed in endless renewal, dissolving into the deep as quickly as it was made. There was no sign of another ship, no bird in the air, no cloud to trouble the smooth dome of sky. In this rare isolation, the Titanic appeared at once immeasurably grand and impossibly small, a single moving shape upon a boundless canvas. At the bow, the air was sharper, the wind carrying with it the taste of salt and a thrilling sense of speed. A group had gathered here, their coats buttoned tight, their cheeks flushed from the cold. They leaned forward into the oncoming air, letting it press against them, scarves streaming like banners. Their laughter rose bright and unrestrained, slipping past their lips and scattering behind them in the ship's wake. In this shared exhilaration, the distinctions of class and origin seemed momentarily erased. They were simply travelers together, facing the same unbroken expanse. Below decks, in the heart of the ship, the engines labored with their steady, measured power. The vibration of their work traveled up through the floors and walls, a reminder that beneath all the elegance and comfort, this was a vessel driven forward by immense unseen forces. In the quiet lounges, one might feel that subtle tremor in the arm of a chair, or see it in the faint ripple of tea in a cup. Rather than unsettling, it offered reassurance. The heartbeat of the voyage was steady, unfaltering, carrying them onward mile by invisible mile. Conversations, both planned and accidental, wove through these hours. In the shade of the promenade's covered section, two strangers found themselves speaking about the homes they had left behind, their words overlapping, their smiles carrying the bittersweet acknowledgement of shared loss. In a quieter corner, an older couple spoke in low voices about their plans for the new life awaiting them, their hands resting lightly together on the bench between them. Even the most casual exchanges seemed touched with a certain openness, as though the knowledge of being carried together into the unknown loosened the boundaries between one person and another. By late afternoon, the light began to change once again, gathering a warmer hue, casting the ship in tones of honey and amber. Shadows stretched across the decks, long and soft-hedged, moving gently with the ship's slow sway. Ahead, the faint veil of mist on the horizon blurred the seam between sea and sky, hinting at the ocean's capacity to change its temperament without warning. The air cooled slightly, the breeze acquiring a sharper edge, though it carried no threat. Only the subtle reminder that they were far from land, in a place ruled by the sea's own rhythms. Yet among the passengers there was no unease. The Titanic's size and gleaming newness, combined with the visible competence of her crew, formed a quiet shield of confidence. People moved through their routines with the ease of those who believe that the day will end as serenely as it began. A man lingered on deck a little longer before heading in for dinner, the low sun painting his face in a warm glow. A woman paused at the railing, her eyes fixed on the way the light pooled in the troughs between waves. Each moment felt, in its own way, like a small act of trust. Trust in the ship, in the sea, and in the journey itself. The day's rhythm settled into a final, unhurried cadence. Movement and stillness blended until they became inseparable, as if every step along the deck and every pause to gaze out to sea were part of the same quiet conversation between traveler and voyage. The Titanic carried them forward with the certainty of a heartbeat, steady and unyielding, her vast shape moving through the water like a living thing. Somewhere ahead lay the unseen shore, but for now, there was only this: the great ship, the wide ocean, and the steady passage of time beneath the endless sky. Morning aboard the Titanic did not arrive all at once, but rather unfurled in slow, deliberate layers, like the steady revealing of a great canvas. Long before most passengers stirred, the eastern horizon was already shifting from the velvet depths of night into the faintest trace of pale gold, a glow that touched the edges of the sea with quiet promise. The air in these earliest hours carried the clean, briny sharpness of the open ocean, tinged with the almost electric freshness that only comes far from land. The Atlantic lay in every direction, breathing in time with the ship's motion, an endless living expanse whose surface changed with each breath of wind. From the upper decks came the constant murmur of water slipping past the hull, a whisper without beginning or end, like an ancient lullaby that had been playing long before the Titanic's keel ever touched the water. Below, in carpeted corridors lit by the soft glow of wall lamps, stewards moved with almost ceremonial quiet, balancing silver trays that bore steaming teapots, delicate china cups, and the faint, mouth-watering aroma of fresh-baked rolls. On the promenade, morning belonged to those who cherished its stillness. The railings were cool beneath the hand, the varnish beaded with tiny droplets of dew that caught the first slanting light like scattered jewels. Couples strolled arm in arm, their silhouettes outlined by the soft gleam of dawn, the women's hats casting delicate, curved shadows across their cheeks, the men drawing their coats closer against the brisk touch of the wind. Somewhere aft, a steward was unrolling canvas chair covers, the fabric snapping once or twice in the breeze before settling over wicker frames. The sea beneath them held a slow, measured heave. Not flat, but tamed by the Titanic's immense weight, into a motion that was less a disturbance than a gentle rocking cradle. Out on the horizon, the rising sun caught the crests of the waves and set them to glittering, each brief flare of silver vanishing as quickly as it appeared, like a secret the sea was sharing only in passing. In first class, the early hours were a world apart, a retreat from the day's inevitable stir. Gentlemen stood at the rail, cigars cupped between gloved fingers, exhaling pale ribbons of smoke that the wind carried swiftly away. Their conversations were muted, words blending into the steady hush of the sea, as if they knew the real purpose of standing there was not to speak, but to breathe in the rarefied air of morning at sea. Addies appeared in twos and threes, their skirts swaying gently with the ship's subtle rhythm, voices lilting as they exchanged plans for the hours ahead. Stewards passed quietly among them, offering tea or a discreet gesture toward the warmth of the dining saloon. Every gleam of brass, every perfectly polished panel of oak, every silent, well-timed courtesy from the crew reminded these passengers that the Titanic was not merely a vessel. She was a carefully curated world, where even the smallest moment was wrapped in elegance. Second class carried its own charm, less about opulence and more about a kind of unpretentious comfort. Morning light streamed generously through the tall dining room windows, turning the tables into pools of soft warmth. The smell of fresh bread and dark fragrant coffee filled the space, mingling with the easy hum of conversation as families and small groups lingered over breakfast. Children pressed their faces to the glass, eyes wide as they watched the waves curl against the ship's hull, before racing away toward the widening wake. Out on the promenade, passengers leaned against the railings or settled into chairs with books, though few kept their eyes on the page for long. The Atlantic's expanse had a way of pulling every gaze outward. Here, the absence of grand staircases and crystal chandeliers did not dim the experience. The ocean itself was the shared luxury, vast and indifferent, yet offering its beauty freely to all. Third class began the day with energy that seemed to rise with the sun. The saloon was alive with a chorus of many languages, voices blending into a warm, human music that rose above the clatter of plates and cutlery. The scent of strong coffee, buttered bread, and simmering porridge filled the air, mingling with the salt carried in on passengers' coats and scarves. Long tables brought strangers into easy conversation, the smallest spark. A comment about the weather, a shared laugh at a child's game, often lit into a longer exchange. Children wove in and out between chairs, laughing in bursts that seemed to brighten even the dimmer corners of the room. For many here, each sunrise marked another step toward a long-dreamed-of destination. And the Titanic was not simply transportation. She was the very threshold to a new life. Beneath all this movement, the cruise day was already in full swing. The galleys were a whirl of purposeful activity. Bread drawn, steaming from ovens, great pots stirred with long-handled spoons, the hiss of water meeting hot metal, and the sharp, clean rhythm of knives on cutting boards. Laundry staff moved baskets of linens in endless rotation, their work steaming the cool air of the passageways. Farther down still, the stokehold glowed with the firelight of the great furnaces, where men worked stripped to their shirts, shoveling coal in an unbroken rhythm that drove the Titanic forward. Their faces were streaked with sweat and coal dust, their movements a mixture of endurance and muscle memory. This was the ship's heartbeat, unseen but essential, its deep pulse felt even in the most refined corners above. Up on the bridge, precision ruled. The officers worked in quiet concentration, their gloved hands steady on polished brass instruments, their eyes scanning both the vast horizon and the fine markings of their charts. The compass was checked, bearings noted in neat, deliberate script. Each entry a small but vital piece of the Titanic's unfolding journey. The sea here looked endless, but the watch kept its focus sharp. Beauty could mask change. The ocean's temperament was known to shift without warning. The air on the bridge was sharper still, the wind constant, threading the scent of salt with the faint smoke drifting back from the funnels. From this vantage, the Titanic's passage was a perfect balance of scale and control, an immense presence cutting a confident path across an immeasurable canvas. By midday, the ship had fully woken. Decks were alive with people, some wrapped in thick wool rugs and sinking deeper into their deck chairs. Others strolling the length of the promenade in pairs or small groups. From open doors drifted the faint strains of music, mingling with the slap of waves against the hull and the creak of the rigging in the wind. In the more sheltered corners, conversations bloomed in low, comfortable tones. In livelier ones, games of shuffleboard brought bursts of laughter and scattered applause. Above and around it all, the Titanic moved with an unhurried authority, great hall meeting each swell with a grace that made the sea seem more companion than adversary. Afternoon settled into a slower rhythm, as if the ship herself had paused to breathe. Tea was served in bright, sunlit rooms, where porcelain cups glowed against crisp linen, and the scent of fresh scones and buttered cakes hung softly in the air. In the libraries, pages turned at a steady, almost meditative pace, while outside the windows the ocean rolled on without change. On the open decks the air carried a sharper bite, the wind tugging playfully at coats and scarves. Some passengers lingered here despite the chill, drawn to the horizon's quiet pull, while others let the warmth indoors wrap around them, content to watch the shifting light from behind glass. As the sun began its slow descent, the ship's mood shifted again. The light deepened into a rich, burnished gold that slid across the decks in long, moving bands. Shadows stretched, soft-edged and languid, as though the day itself were unwinding. Stewards moved with quiet efficiency now, their polished shoes clicking softly against the wooden planks as they prepared for the evening meal. Somewhere inside the orchestra began to tune, the faint notes threading their way into the cooling air. From the galley came the richer aromas of dinner. Roasted meats, fresh bread, sauces thick with promise, drifting upward into the open sky. Evening aboard the Titanic was a performance in its own right. First class, the dining saloon glittered with light. Each table, a careful composition of crystal, silver, and polished wood. Voices blended into a harmonious murmur, punctuated now and then by laughter or the clink of glasses. In second class, the meals were generous and lively, full of conversation that carried the warmth of familiarity. In third class, the atmosphere was louder still, hearty, unreserved, and often followed by music that spilled into the corridors and out onto the decks, where it mingled with the rush of the sea. After dinner, the ship shifted into the softer tempo of night. In lounges, card games continued beneath the glow of shaded lamps, the quiet snap of shuffled decks blending with the low hum of conversation. The scent of brandy hung in the air, occasionally joined by the blue curl of cigar smoke. On deck, the cold was sharper now, but the reward was above, a sky vast and crystalline. each star so brilliant it seemed almost within reach. Words often failed here, replaced by the silent awe of standing beneath such an expanse. Night at sea was its own world. From afar, the Titanic's lights glowed warm against the surrounding darkness, casting long, trembling reflections that followed her in the black water. Inside, cabins became small sanctuaries, their curtains drawn, their lamplight soft. Corridors muffled footsteps, and the last murmurs of conversation faded into the hush. Yet deep below, in the engine rooms, there was no pause, only the steady, unbroken rhythm of the ship's pulse, pushing her ever onward. And so, life at sea passed not as mere days on a calendar, but as a continuous weave of moments. The shifting light, the change in the wind, the rise and fall of voices. Every breath of the ocean, every creak of timber, every unseen act of work was stitched into the voyage's memory. For those aboard, the Titanic was not only a passage across water, but a self-contained world afloat between two shores, carrying its own seasons in miniature across the boundless Atlantic. There are places where tension does not arrive like a storm, but slips in like a cool draft beneath a door. Small, persistent, almost polite in the way it announces itself. On a ship that glides through calm seas, the most pressing disagreements are seldom loud. They fold into the fabric of daily life as a crease that will not quite lie flat. You can feel them if you pay attention. The tiny frown that appears when a steward clears a plate a moment too soon. The unspoken impatience of a passenger whose letter has not yet reached the postal clerk. The careful way neighbors on the promenade choose their words to avoid an old quarrel. These are not the heroic conflicts of novels, but the quiet frictions that reveal what people value. Comfort, recognition, the small certainties that make a journey bearable. Listen to the ship now, its steady engines. The soft scrape of boots on brass end. Imagine how each small complaint and each gentle accommodation adds up. Like pebbles dropped into a wide, placid pool, their ripples crossing and meeting until they create a pattern you can sense more than see. In first class, the tensions often wear the same smile as the silverware. Manners act as a gentle barrier between dissatisfaction and outcry. A mislaid invitation, a seating arranged without consent, or a dress that fails to meet an imagined standard can sit heavy beneath the surface of polite conversation. Under the gilt chandeliers, people measure one another with the same care they measure their words softly, precisely because reputation is a fragile thing even amidst abundance. A hostess arranges a salon as if laying out a small ecosystem, and when someone's anecdote stumbles or a promised acquaintance does not arrive, the air tightens for a heartbeat. But alongside these small vexations, there is reserve and a kind of private courage, the willingness to hold your displeasure in order to keep an evening gentle for others, the quiet decision to forgive a slight rather than amplify it in public. In the hush of the lounge, perfume and pipe smoke mingle in ribbons, and beneath those ribbons people practice restraint as if it were another elegant art. Second class carries a different kind of hush-less gilded, more practical, threaded through with the soft anxiety of plans not yet assured. Here, the tensions are about time and money, about whether an appointment will be kept or a letter will reach a relative waiting on the other side. A man might count coins beneath his napkin while laughing at a story, or a woman might fold and refold a recently arrived photograph, smoothing it as if she could iron out the worry living in the margins. Children test their voices against the order of the day. An argument over who sits where at a long table can flare and then settle into an embarrassed silence that leaves everyone slightly changed. Yet the same compartments that hold worry also hold tenderness. A passenger who offers their blanket to a shivering neighbor. The quiet practice of sharing bread and stories so that fear becomes lighter in company. Courage here is practical and unassuming, the kind that wakes before dawn to mend a cuff, or that opens a pocket to offer a small coin, or that writes a hopeful line in a letter to be posted ashore. Down among the third-class bunks, where the air tastes of boiled cabbage and fresh soap, the conflicts are rawer and the courage more visible in the plainness of daily survival. Families huddle over steaming cups, and with a low, private dignity, they make space for grief and hope in the same breath. There are soft disputes over who will watch a sleeping child while another fetches water, over the last piece of bread that must be divided into parts, and, in those small reckonings, people show themselves in ways that luxury cannot buy. A mother calms a crying infant with a song that has nothing to do with language and everything to do with patience. An old man hums a tune from home to anchor the room against homesickness. The music of a fiddle in the corner knits those voices into a temporary family, and the courage is in the hands that steady a fragile bowl, the shoulders that absorb another's burden without complaint. These acts are quiet, often unnoticed by those who pass on the higher decks, but they are the steady, uncelebrated backbone of the ship's life. Below decks, where cold dust settles into seams and the heat is a living thing, the crew carry their own conflicts, wrapped in duty. Stokers work in a rhythm that is physical and almost meditative, shoveling the black light into hungry mouths that keep the ship moving. Their complaints are not for strangers, but for the small injustices of fatigue and weather. An engineer feels the weight of responsibility as a tangible pressure. Every bolt recalls 1,000 decisions The quiet argument is often with time itself. How long to press on, when to ease, whether to trust a gauge, or the feel of the engines beneath your feet. Stewards navigate a different terrain of conflict. Men whose work is to provide comfort while enduring their own tiredness, who answer the same questions with the same masks of patience until they must find a way to speak the truth softly. There will be room, they say, or soon, and mean it. The courage of the crew is not dramatic. It is the steady competence that keeps plates level and furnaces fed. The decision to wake when others sleep because the safety and ease of many depend on a few tireless hands. Among the officers, where responsibility was measured in bearings, knots, and the fine sweep of a compass needle, disagreements moved with the slow, deliberate weight of tides. A suggestion was rarely met with immediate words. Instead, there would be a stillness. It's the kind that gathers when men stand shoulder to shoulder over a chart spread across the navigation table, their eyes tracing the penciled lines as though searching for an answer hidden in the grain of the paper. The dim light of the bridge lamps cast soft halos on their faces, highlighting the slight furrow of brows, the tightening of a jaw, the faint flex of a hand resting on the edge of the table. Pride existed here, tempered by the understanding that a single poor decision could echo through steel, timber, and every life aboard. A junior officer might clear his throat quietly before offering a suggestion, aware that even a low voice could shift the course. The senior officer, seasoned by years of salt air and shifting seas, would weigh the words in silence. The hush broken only by the gentle creak of the wheel or the whisper of wind against glass. Sometimes the sea itself seemed to listen in, black and endless, offering no opinion, yet lending its own pressure to the moment. The courage here was found in the willingness to bend one's will toward the best course, even if it meant altering one's own long-held instincts. In admitting that another's reasoning might be sharper tonight than your own, in keeping a tone as steady as the horizon line, no matter the strain beneath. Scattered through the Titanic's decks were objects that carried in them the quiet tension of entire unspoken stories. A letter folded and refolded until its creases were soft, stayed tucked in a coat pocket, because its words felt too heavy to release into the hands of a postal clerk. A small silver locket, never opened in company, held the face of someone far away, a reminder both of warmth and of the distance that dulled it. A pair of gloves dropped in a corridor might be returned without a word by the very person they had last exchanged cross looks with, the simple act becoming a silent truce. A young sailor, noticing a knitted child's cap left behind on a deck chair in the early light, slipped it gently into his jacket and carried it until he could return it to its small owner, saying nothing, only smiling as the child beamed. An elderly passenger in the lounge might see a young couple hover for a seat and rise. With a bow so unobtrusive it seemed part of the act of standing, an offer given without the weight of debt. These moments were small, almost weightless, yet they rippled through the ship, softening the day in ways no announcement could. In these moments lay a lesson so quiet it might be missed by those in search of grander displays, that life's truest negotiations often happen in the shadows between words. That conflict need not be a tempest to matter, and that courage, more often than not, wears no uniform, makes no speech, and asks for no witness. The Titanic was a world contained, a floating city where lives brushed close, breaths shared in narrow corridors, laughter and sighs mingling across thin walls. In that closeness, even the smallest gesture could weigh heavy. To hold back a sharp word, to tilt a conversation, to ward lightness rather than let it sink. To grant another the space to be exactly as they were, these were acts as vital as the keeping of watch or the tending of engines. If you stood still in a quiet passageway, you might hear them. The soft chime of porcelain returned to its saucer with deliberate care. The gentle clearing of a throat as someone shifts from irritation to courtesy, the deep breath before an apology shapes itself. As the ship's day slid toward evening, these unremarkable struggles began to fold themselves away like garments returned to their drawers. Some were settled with a smile and a meeting of eyes, others with the kind of silence that agrees to let the matter rest. The bravery in this was subtle but no less real. To choose the path that allowed another to sleep without a lingering shadow. To keep a quarrel to oneself when airing it would only tangle more threads. To extend a hand in small reconciliation, even when pride suggested otherwise. In the cooling air of the corridors, after dinner plates were cleared, the ship's heartbeat seemed to slow. A lamp left glowing outside a cabin door felt like a promise. The faint scent of lavender from a steward's evening turned down drifted like a note of reassurance through the hush. Somewhere, the quiet sweep of a broom on a polished deck marked not just the end of a day, but the careful tending of shared space. Below, in the crew's quarters, the same pattern played out in different forms. A stoker and a trimmer, who had spent hours working in silence after a brief, sharp exchange, might end their shift by sharing a cigarette in the cool air near an open hatch, the smoke curling upward into the dark. A steward who had endured the sting of a passenger's impatience might fold the memory into the day's used linens, letting it go with the same care he gave to smoothing the creases from fresh sheets. Here, courage was the discipline to return to one's post the next day with no trace of resentment. To let the rhythm of work and the bond of shared duty wash away the salt of small disagreements. In the public rooms, passengers performed similar rituals. A woman, finding her chair at the card table taken, might instead wander to the windows and lose herself in the slow unfurling of the ocean under the night sky. A man stung by a careless remark might pour tea for the very neighbor who had said it, letting the warmth of the act outweigh the coolness of the words. The ship, in these moments, seemed to breathe easier, as if the easing of tempers lightened the burden she carried. Sometimes it was the sea itself that offered perspective. A change in the wind that slipped across the deck like a whispered suggestion. A sudden clearing of clouds to reveal a horizon so far it seemed to promise infinite tomorrows. The faint salty tank in the air sharpening as night fell. Passengers lingered at the rail, hands resting on the cool, varnished wood, feeling the hum of the ship beneath them. That steady pulse that did not care for the small tempests of human nature. Against that vastness, grievances shrank until they could be set down entirely, and in their place came a quieter kind of strength, the kind that asked nothing more than to keep moving forward. And so the voyage wove itself from these threads. The hush after a disagreement softened, the hand offered in truce, the unacknowledged acts of grace that floated invisibly between strangers and companions alike. By the time the stars burned bright in their thousands and the ship's lights shimmered across the black water, the small tensions of the day had joined the deep, unseen current carrying them all toward the horizon. The Titanic kept her counsel, holding these private victories close, while above, the night and the ocean conspired to carry them forward, steady and unbroken. Night has a way of softening even the sharpest outlines, and aboard the Titanic it folded over the decks like a great velvet curtain drawn slowly across the sky. The day's chatter thinned to a murmur, leaving behind only the gentle punctuation of footsteps on wooden boards and the muted click of doors closing for the night. The air shifted with the change, cooler and sharper, carrying a clarity that seemed to pass straight through fabric and skin. Standing at the rail, one could sense the ship's immensity, not so much through sight, but through the deep physical hum beneath the deck, the steady, unbroken heartbeat of her engines, pressing forward into a darkness that seemed without end. Above, the sky stretched into a perfect vault, scattered with stars so numerous and bright they erased the line between ocean and heavens, leaving the strange impression of floating between two infinite seas, one above, one below. The Atlantic lay astonishingly still, its surface black and glassy, mirroring the stars with such precision that it was impossible to tell where reflection ended and reality began. For most passengers, wrapped in their conversations or books, nothing felt unusual. Yet for anyone attuned to the small currents beneath comfort, there was a whisper of faint uneasy that something unseen drifted out there in the dark. On the bridge, the night was a place of deliberate movement and careful sound. Officers stood at their stations with boots planted firmly, the wood beneath them breathing faintly under the constant vibration of the ship's machinery. The air here was tinged with salt and varnished oak, stirred occasionally by a gust that brushed across the face before vanishing into stillness again. Lanterns cast steady pools of gold across charts spread like patient puzzles on the table, the edges of paper curling slightly in the damp night air. Bearings were checked with the precision of ritual. The soft snap of a compass lid closing sounded as clean and final as a watch clasp fastening shut. From the wireless room came narrow slips of paper, each one inscribed in steady hand reports of ice from ships far ahead, terse coordinates, small details that the officers read, folded, and placed aside. No alarm sounded, no voices were raised, only the weighing of choices: ease the engines and lose time, or keep the schedule that would deliver them to New York with the clockwork perfection expected of such a vessel. That decision seemed to hang, balanced and delicate, in the air between them.
Out!
While below their feet, the Titanic's vast pulse drove her forward without hesitation. High above, in the crow's nest, two lookouts kept their vigil in the small wooden shelter, the night reduced to the wind against their cheeks and the endless black ahead. Out. Their breath came in slow plumes, catching momentary silver in the starlight before vanishing into the dark. They swept the horizon with eyes trained for the faintest shadow, the smallest change in the texture of the sea. Yet the water was too calm, so still. It felt almost staged, like a world holding its movement in some private conspiracy. No foam broke the swells, no whitecaps to catch the light, only the smooth, unbroken skin of the ocean. The crow's nest swayed in slow arcs, the ropes creaked softly, and beneath all of it was the steady, muffled thrum of the Injinsa sound that belonged to another hidden world far below. In the first-class smoking room, the lateness of the hour seemed to bend time into something slower, more luxurious. The fire in the grate burned with a controlled glow, casting elongated shadows that stretched across patterned carpets before folding into themselves. The air was perfumed with the mingling scents of expensive tobacco and leather, polished by countless hands. Conversations lingered without urgencies, stories of past voyages, observations about the smoothness of this crossing, casual praise for the ship's steadiness. The confidence in those voices was not reckless, but rooted in habit. The sea had always been an obedient stage for their lives. Yet if a hand rested against the window, the cold bite of the glass reminded them, however faintly, that this floating palace existed in the middle of a vast and indifferent wilderness. Still they reclined deeper into their chairs, sipped their brandy, and let the hours pass, certain that nothing could intrude on the calm they inhabited. In the second-class lounge, light pooled warmly over polished tables where couples leaned together over letters and postcards. The soft fragrance of tea leaves lingered in the air, mingling with the faint damp scent of wool coats hung to dry after the day's brisk winds. Laughter came in gentle ripples, often giving way to quieter moments where someone stared out through the thick glass at the silver-dusted night beyond. The stars outside looked close enough to touch, sharp points hammered into the deep black canopy of sky. Now and then, a pause fell in conversation as someone noticed the uncanny stillness pressing against the ship. But such moments dissolved quickly back into talk of plans, addresses, and the lives waiting across the Atlantic. Far down in the third-class common rooms, the night came alive with an entirely different energy. The low ceilings bounced back, the rhythm of boots striking in time to fiddles and accordions. The air was thick with the smell of stew and fresh bread, beer and sweat, a warmth that clung to skin and filled the lungs. The voyage was measured not in miles but in songs sung, verses shouted in familiar tongues, mugs raised in rhythm to the music. Doors opened briefly to admit latecomers, letting in cold air tinged with salt before shutting again to trap the heat and light inside. Out there was the dark sea. In here was life, defiant and unafraid. Below, in the engine rooms, night was defined by heat and relentless work. Stokers shoveled coal into roaring mouths of fire, their movements a dance of necessity, their skin shining with sweat despite the cold world only feet above their heads. Each clang of shovel against steel was met with the deep-bellied rumble of machinery, a sound felt as much as heard. The air vibrated with power, the furnaces breathing in and out like living creatures. Orders passed quickly, almost wordlessly, through men who understood that their labor was invisible to the passengers above, yet vital to every comfort on board. Any change in the ship's fate would arrive here not as sight or sound, but as a subtle difference in the beat of the engines it changed no one wanted to feel. Along the promenade, frost glittered faintly under lamplight, dusting the railings with fragile lace. The cold gnawed at fingers and cheeks, but those who ventured out walked slowly, breathing plumes of mist into the still air. The boards beneath their feet thrummed gently, a reminder of the unstoppable force propelling them forward. The sea, smooth and dark, gave back no sound but the soft hiss of parted water. Somewhere far beyond sight, ice drifted in ancient silence. Here, the only certainty was the cold, and the endless horizon stretching in every direction. In one small cabin, a passenger awoke with no clear reason. The dimness was broken only by a pale wash of starlight through the porthole. The ship's vibration was steady beneath the mattress, but tonight it felt subtly different, though in a way too delicate to name. They lay still, listening, to the faint murmur of water, the muted beat of machinery, the occasional soft shift of timbers as the ship moved. The sounds were unchanged, yet something in them seemed altered, as if a single, almost inaudible note had been added to the chord. Sleep would not come again. Inside the warmth of the first-class spaces, the looming vastness beyond the windows was no more than a backdrop and exquisite, silent stage upon which life's most familiar comforts continued their performance. In the smoking room, men leaned back in deep leather chairs, the low murmur of conversation mingling with the glow of embers in the hearth. The faint haze of cigar smoke curled lazily in the lamplight, carrying with it the scent of privilege and ease. Glasses clinked softly. Laughter flared and subsided in comfortable rhythm. Yet if one's gaze strayed to the frosted edge of a window pane, there was the reminder sharp and cold that this floating world existed at the mercy of another, vaster one. Beyond that thin barrier of glass lay air so frigid it could steal a breath in seconds, and water so cold it would take more than breath away. This illusion of safety was complete and fragile. Down in the second-class lounge, the air was softer, touched with the faint, lingering fragrance of tea leaves and the comforting murmur of voices speaking of plans and reunions. Couples bent over shared letters, tracing words with fingertips as though to imprint them into memory, while others studied the crisp clarity of the night through thick glass windows. Outside, the sky seemed impossibly vast, the stars hard and bright like nails driven into a sheet of midnight velvet. From time to time, a passenger would pause mid-sentence, distracted by the uncanny stillness pressing against the ship, stillness so complete it seemed to swallow even the thought of movement. It was not fear exactly, but an unease that passed like a shadow through the room, subtle, unspoken, quickly smoothed over with a smile or a return to a story. Out on the open decks, the cold had deepened into something that felt alive, as if the night itself had teeth. Frost clung to the railings in delicate patterns, each crystal sparkling under the faint wash of starlight before vanishing into shadow. The sea was so utterly still that it seemed to hold its breath, and in that unnatural calm the ship's passage felt less like movement and more like an unbroken glide into some vast, uncharted void. From the crow's nest came the muted scrape of boots shifting for warmth, the only human sound in a world otherwise stripped of motion. Far ahead, the horizon was nothing but darkness, no foam, no wave, no light, only a silence so perfect it rang in the ears. In that silence, the Titanic felt both invincible and impossibly fragile. A steel giant sailing through a glass world, every beat of her engines an unknowing countdown. No one on deck could name the source of the unease, but they could feel it, coiling invisibly in the cold, waiting for the moment when the stillness would finally, suddenly, break. There comes a moment in any long voyage when the traveler's attention shifts, no longer anchored solely in the excitement of what lies ahead, but drifting gently toward the spaces they have already left behind. At first, it happens so quietly it could be mistaken for nothing at all. Perhaps it begins on the promenade at dusk, when the rail is cold beneath gloved hands, and the wake trails away in pale, endless ribbons that vanish into the black. The water glows faintly where the ship has cut through. a ghostly memory dissolving back into the sea. And in that vanishing trace, the mind finds an echo. Each mile gained is also a mile abandoned. Each turn of the propeller carrying you further from the rooms, voices, and familiar patterns that once defined your days. It may arrive instead in the library, where the gentle rustle of a turning page recalls another page, turned in another place, by a familiar hand now far away. It is not yet grief nor even longing in its sharpest form, but a slow, inevitable tide creeping over the shoreline of the heart. In the polished, hushed realms of first class, where loss is wrapped in velvet and distilled through the thin porcelain walls of teacups, this awareness is often disguised beneath layers of etiquette. A gentleman sits near the broad windows of the lounge, folding a letter along precise creases, as though the geometry of paper might keep his emotions orderly. The ink is still dark with urgency, meant for someone who waits an ocean away. And yet its journey will be measured in days of water and time before a reply can ever arrive. He tucks it into his jacket with a faint, almost imperceptible sigh. Across the room, a woman cradles her coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep through kid leather gloves. Her gaze is unfixed, her mind walking barefoot through the garden she left behind past the rose bushes in early bloom, across the cool grass still wet with morning dew. She does not speak of this to her companions. Instead, she inquires lightly about the evening's music, her voice perfectly modulated.
Yes.
Yet under each poised phrase hums the low chord of absence, steady and unresolved. In second class, distance and departure are spoken of more openly, though softened with a kind of shared tenderness. Couples lean together on benches along the deck, their breath mingling in the crisp air. Voices pitched low against the steady undertone of the engines, exchange stories of children waved off at the quay, of friends whose silhouettes grew smaller until the sea swallowed them from sight, of Sunday walks now deferred until months ahead. Here, there is no theater, no deliberate concealment, only the quiet act of shaping loss into words, so that its weight is distributed. Between two people, instead of carried alone, some passengers write their thoughts in letters by lamplight, each word chosen as if it might span the distance itself. Others simply stand at the rail, watching the stars prick holes in the fabric of the sky, and trust the wind to carry unspoken thoughts homeward. In the crowded, lively spaces of third-class loss often carries the weight of something permanent, a finality that even music cannot quite disguise. Here many of the passengers have left not for a season but for the rest of their lives. The old streets will not be walked again, the old dialects spoken only to themselves in moments of solitude. The fields where generations worked now tilled by other hands, yet tonight the common rooms thrum with life. Fiddles sing in high, bright voices. Accordions weave harmonies both joyous and bittersweet, and boots stamp out rhythms that echo the heartbeats of those gathered. Laughter bursts like sparks from a fire rising above the music in quick, warm flashes. But between the verses and the breaths between dances, there are moments when eyes meet and hold, acknowledging what the melodies themselves cannot fully mask, that hope and loss are twined together like two strands of the same rope. The songs may carry fragments of the old life into the new, but they also make permanent the knowledge that what has been left will remain forever, just out of reach. On the bridge, an officer stands his watch in the brittle cold of the night, his silhouette framed by the faint, steady glow of the binnacle light. The brass rail beneath his glove is cold and unyielding, the kind of cold that seeps through fabric and into bone. Each breath he exhales turns briefly into a pale ghost before dissolving into the darkness. His ears are attuned to the ship in ways that go beyond hearing. He feels her in the soles of his boots, in the subtle vibration of her great heart beating below. The stillness of the ocean tonight is deep, almost absolute, but he does not let it lull him. Experience has taught him that such calm can be a prelude nights, when the sea wears a mask so perfect that the change, when it comes, feels like betrayal. His eyes scan the darkness for the smallest shift in shadow or sheen, noting the glint of starlight off a ripple, the shape of the horizon where sky and sea fuse into one vast, silent expanse. Every faint variation is entered in the private log he keeps in his mind, a record not of facts but of instincts, for he knows that out here, instinct is as necessary as any instrument. Below decks, in the furnace-bright belly of the Titanic, loss takes on a form that is both physical and constanta, steady surrender of hours. muscle, and sweat to the mechanical appetite of the ship. The stokers work stripped to shirts, their faces and forearms slick with the heat that roars from the furnace mouths. Coal dust clings to damp skin and fine black grains that will take hours to scrub away. The air is thick with the scent of burning fuel, hot metal, and the faint salt of human labor. Each shovelful of coal is flung with practiced precision into the orange blaze, where it vanishes with a roar like a great beast inhaling. The engineers, moving with quieter purpose, place their hands lightly against the massive engines, feeling for changes too subtle to see. To them, each vibration is a syllable in a language they have spent years learning to read, a language that tells them when she is running smoothly and when she hungers for attention. They will not see the frost on the rails above, nor the glitter of the stars reflected in the sea, but they will carry the ship forward through both beauty and danger, unseen and uncelebrated. There is another, quieter kind of loss that takes place in the still corridors and in the spaces between conversations. The gradual shedding of an earlier self. The sea, with its unbroken horizons and the slow cadence of days, encourages a certain loosening of the past. At first, the change is imperceptible. Man who once measured his worth in speed now finds satisfaction in sitting an hour with nothing but the shifting light on the waves for company. A woman who feared unfamiliar company now leans easily toward strangers at dinner, offering stories as if they had been friends for years. It happens so gradually that it cannot be marked on any calendar. Yet one day, perhaps long after disembarking, they will realize that the person who stepped aboard was not the same as the one who stepped ashore. Something has been left behind, not lost in grief, but released, like an anchor cut free, to let the ship move more icily forward. In the earliest hours of morning, when most of the ship still sleeps and the sea is wrapped in a muted hush, frost begins to form in secret patterns along the railings, porthole rims, and window panes. It creeps in delicate tendrils, each branch splitting into smaller, finer lines until the metal and glass are etched with living lace. Under the faint wash of pre-dawn light, these crystals glint as if dusted with powdered diamonds, each one catching the first timid fire of the sun. The cold air is sharp enough to make breath sting in the throat, but it is clean, almost luminous, carrying the faint temps of salt and something older, deeper, the breath of the ocean itself. Passengers who rise early find themselves pausing here, fingertips hovering just above the frost as if afraid to disturb its perfection. Some trace the fragile designs with a gloved finger, watching them blur and melt instantly at the touch. Others simply stand and watch, unwilling to break the spell. The beauty lasts only minutes before the warmth of the day erases it completely, leaving no mark except in memory. And yet that brief, vanishing brilliance seems to speak a truth the sea knows well, that impermanence is its own kind of grace. The sea offers other lessons, too, for those willing to listen in its slow, endless voice. One can stand at the rail and watch the ship's wake unfurl in pale ribbons, each swirl and crest alive for only a moment before dissolving back into the vastness. In minutes, the water closes over itself as though the Titanic had never passed, smoothing away every trace of her journey. And yet, even as it erases the past, the sea is carrying her forward, always towards something unseen. It is a contradiction that feels oddly comforting, that loss and progress are not opposites but parts of the same movement. The horizon itself seems to embody this truth, retreating endlessly but never disappearing, promising that there is always something ahead, even when what lies behind has already faded from sight. Inside the ship, life moves to its own gentle, measured cadence. It's a clink of china, the murmur of voices, the faint vibration of the engines through the soles of one's shoes weave into a pattern so constant that it becomes a kind of lullaby. Letters are written in the quiet glow of cabin lamps, sealed and set aside with care. Meals appear in orderly procession, eaten and cleared away with the efficiency of long-practiced hands. The absence that once ached like a fresh wound softens into a background presence, no longer sharp but still felt a subtle companion to every step taken on the gently swaying decks. People begin to carry it more easily, folding it into the fabric of their days, the way one grows accustomed to the rhythm of the sea beneath them. Some will remember this night or this voyage not for grand events, but for the smallest, most personal details. In the third-class common room, A song rises and drifts into the corridors, its melody warm against the cool hush outside. It is carried on the voices of those who know its words by heart, voices that weave together until the tune seems less sung than breathed. In the stillness of first-class cabins, the frost remembered from morning will return as an image in the mind's eye etched silver against the dark, dissolving under the faint kiss of sunlight. On the open deck, the stars will linger in memory as impossibly close, like lanterns hung just beyond reach, each one a reminder of the vastness, both above and below. Every recollection is its own truth, shaped by the eyes and heart that hold it. And the Titanic herself moves forward, steady and unswerving, her great hull slicing a silent path through the dark water. From a distance, she is a floating constellation, her decks lit in gold, her funnels trailing ribbons of smoke that fade into the black sky. Below, her engines work with tireless rhythm, pushing her onward. Above, the constellations keep their eternal watch. They have seen ships greater and smaller than this one, watch them rise on the horizon and slip away again into memory, and they will see countless more in the ages to come. Yet tonight their cold, patient light falls on this ship, on these people, on this moment in time that will never come again. The light itself becomes a kind of thread tying everything together. It glimmers in the chandeliers of the dining saloons, spills in slender arcs from the promenade lamps, gleams in the sheen of polished brass and the quiet gleam of crystal. It is reflected in the eyes of strangers who meet by chance, in the curve of a smile offered to someone who needed it more than they knew. This light is not the bold, blazing kind that banishes shadows, but a gentler glow that reveals just enough to remind one of the shared humanity aboard. It bridges the distances between decks, between languages, between lives that will diverge again when the voyage ends. And here, at the quiet heart of the ship's progress, there is an unspoken understanding that binds everyone, whether they feel it consciously or not, that to move forward is to leave something behind, and that this is neither tragedy nor triumph, but simply the nature of all journeys. A man leaning on the rail may feel it as the weight of the cold steel under his palms, the hum of the ship flowing up through his arms. A woman sitting in a lounge may sense it in the way her thoughts wander from what she has lost to what she might yet find. It is a truth carried in the deep thrum of the engines, in the patient pull of the sea, in the silent watch of the stars, an unbroken thread linking loss, lesson, and light into a single endless motion. It is a strange and almost invisible thing, the way a legacy begins to grow while the story itself is still being lived. It rarely announces itself in a grand gesture or a moment of self-recognition. Instead, it takes root quietly, almost shyly, in the subtle ways people speak, move, and remember. Even before the Titanic reached the midpoint of her voyage, before the idea of an ending, tragic or otherwise, had crossed anyone's mind, she was already becoming more than a vessel cutting through the Atlantic. She had assumed a symbolic weight, a living emblem of what her age believed about itself, that human mastery could command nature without provocation, that steel could be graceful, that power could be quiet, and that the ocean, vast and ancient, could be engaged on equal terms. This belief traveled with her in more than just her physical grandeur. It was present in the polished gleam of banisters, touched by countless gloved hands, in the scent of varnished wood mingling with salt air, in the rhythmic hum of her engines that seemed less mechanical and more like the measured breath of some benevolent giant. Even those who had never set foot aboard her felt this sense of majesty. Dockside workers craned their necks to watch her slip into the horizon. Tavern conversations paused to pass her name from one storyteller to another, and fishermen seeing her silhouette at sea felt the stir of something extraordinary, as though they had glimpsed the edge of the future. In the lounges of first class, this sense of significance unfolded in conversations that were as carefully arranged as the flowers in their vases. Here words were chosen not merely for their meaning, but for the grace of their delivery, every sentence polished like silver. Men in tailored evening jackets leaned back in leather armchairs that sighed under the shift of weight, their cigars tracing slow, fragrant spirals into the air, while they compared the Titanic to other vessels of their acquaintance. They spoke of her steadiness, the way she seemed not to ride the waves, but to fold them beneath her hull. How her engines, though powerful enough to move a mountain, purred in a low and even heartbeat that one felt more than heard. how she moved with the serene composure of something utterly certain of its own supremacy. Pride colored these exchanges, not a brash, conquering pride, but the dignified satisfaction of knowing they were part of something that represented the pinnacle of their world. Yet their admiration was not confined to the vastness of her engineering. It lingered in the delicate interplay of light and scent and sound that gave the Titanic a life of her own. The sunlight, filtering through the glass dome above the grand staircase, fractured into golden beams that spilled down the carved balustrades, casting shifting patterns across the deep pile of the carpet. It was not just light. It was the warm embrace of morning contained within architecture, a domestic comfort made monumental. The flowers, lilies, roses, and sprays of fresh greenery were replenished daily, their fragrance barely perceptible, yet enough to soften the tang of salt in the air, creating an atmosphere where nature and steel coexisted in harmony. Even the quiet movements of the stewards formed part of this living picture. The soft thud of polished shoes on thick carpeting, the discreet murmur of a question asked and answered, the way a silver tray was set down with such precision that not a drop of tea rippled in its cup. This was not merely service. It was ritual, an unspoken pact that aboard the Titanic, life would proceed with grace. In second class, the shaping of the Titanic's legacy was more understated. Yet for those who experienced it, it was no less extraordinary. The decks, wide and uncluttered, invited long, unhurried walks, where passengers could lean on gleaming rails and feel the crisp salt wind in their faces without dodging cargo or crew. The dining saloon was bright with daylight streaming through tall windows, its tables laid with spotless linens and simple but elegant tableware. The food was served hot with care, and the service carried a warmth that suggested genuine regard rather than mere obligation. For many, these were not small details, they were revelations. Here was a ship that seemed to treat each passenger, regardless of status, as part of her story, extending to them not simply transport but participation in an event of rare dignity. In third class, the Titanic's promise was felt in simpler, perhaps purer terms, yet these simplicities carried the weight of rare treasure. The cabins, though modest in size, were clean and well ventilated, with bedding that smelled faintly of soap and fresh air. A quiet luxury for many who had known only the damp and cramped berths of lesser ships. Each blanket was neatly folded, each pillow fluffed with the kind of care that spoke of respect for those who would rest there. The meals, served with regularity and abundance, were not only nourishing, but comforting, a bowl of hot stew after a brisk walk on deck. Thick slices of bread still warm from the oven, butter that softened instantly under the heat of one's fingers. Families who might once have endured a crossing in dark, airless holds now found themselves able to wash in clean basins, to rest without the drip of water overhead, to eat at long tables where conversation rose and fell in a dozen accents. Children, released from the confines of crowded tenements or the dust of rural lanes, turned the ship's corridors into playgrounds, their laughter skipping off the metal walls like bright, uncatchable birds. On the open decks, they chased the wind, their cheeks flushed and their eyes wide, as if trying to drink in the endless sky. Young men leaned on the rails at night, their collars turned up against the chill, trading stories of the lives they had left behind and the dreams that seemed suddenly closer beneath the stars. In these small moments, the clean linen, the steady meals, the room to breathe, the Titanic's greatness revealed itself not through opulence, but through the gift of dignity to those who had expected so much less. The crew, too, carried within them the quiet certainty that they were part of something destined to outlast its own voyage. Officers walked the decks with a particular kind of pride, not the loud chest-out swagger of soldiers on parade, but a calm, deliberate bearing that seemed to say they understood the privilege and responsibility of their charge. Their uniforms, pressed to perfection, caught the faint gleam of the lamps as they passed, the brass buttons shining like miniature suns in the night. They moved between passengers and ship's railings like steady currents in the sea, always in motion, yet never hurried. Stewards learned the subtleties of those in their care, which gentleman preferred his tea without sugar, which lady asked for an extra pillow just before retiring, which family liked their evening meal a touch earlier to suit their children. This attentiveness was not merely a matter of service. It was a personal contribution to the great performance the Titanic staged each day. In the galleys, the air shimmered with heat and the scent of roasting meats and freshly baked bread, where cooks and assistants danced in unspoken choreography, knowing that each dish placed before a passenger was another line in the story the ship told. Deep in the bowels of the vessel, in the engine rooms where the heat wrapped around the men like a living thing, stokers fed the roaring furnaces in relentless rhythm, their skin gleaming with sweat, their faces streaked with coal dust. They worked without expectation of applause, yet every beat of the Titanic's great steel heart testified to their endurance, binding them to her legacy in ways that few would ever see. The weather, too, seemed to have chosen its allegiance, as though some ancient and impartial force had decided that the Titanic's journey should unfold in conditions worthy of her grandeur. Day after day, the skies arched in flawless, uninterrupted blue, stretching so far and so clean that it seemed one might sail into the very curve of the heavens. Sunlight poured over the decks in a golden flood, gilding every polished rail and turning the ship's varnished wood into bands of deep, glowing amber. The air itself felt rinsed and new, carrying the scent of salt without any trace of harshness. And passengers lingered outside simply to breathe it, their cheeks warmed by the sun, even as the wind curled cool and playful around their faces. The sea below lay in a state of extraordinary calm, an immense, glassy plain that caught the sunlight in shifting patterns, as if invisible hands were brushing ripples into a canvas of liquid light. At night, the transformation was almost otherworldly. The vault of sky became a black silk curtain pierced by a million points of icy fire, stars so sharp and numerous they seemed close enough to pluck from the darkness. The horizon vanished completely, dissolving the line between sea and sky, until the Titanic herself felt suspended in an endless, luminous void. Passengers spoke often of the fairness of the crossings, some attributing it to the skill of her captain and crew, others to sheer luck, and a few, in half-jesting tones, to the ship's own undeniable charm. Yet beneath these casual remarks lingered a shared, unspoken awe, the quiet conviction that perhaps even nature had taken notice of her passage and chosen, for reasons beyond human guessing, to grant her a voyage as smooth and dignified as the vessel herself. More privately, her legacy was being spun into the intimate and unrepeatable moments that belonged entirely to those aboard. Threads so fine that they might have gone unnoticed, if not for the way they imprinted themselves on memory. On the sheltered expanse of the promenade, a young couple met for the very first time, not through the careful introductions of family or mutual acquaintances, but by the simple accident of both pausing to watch the horizon at the same instant. Their conversation began in halting exchanges, stitched together by the low hush of the sea slipping along the hull. And yet as the minutes passed, the pauses grew warmer, the silences shared rather than awkward. In the dim corner of the smoking room, a writer traveling alone sat with a fountain pen poised above crisp paper, trying to trap in words the particular quality of light that pooled on the polished wood, the muted rumble of voices layered over the occasional clink of glass, the way the ship seemed to breathe with a steady, living rhythm. Elsewhere, a child stood at the very tip of the bow, face lifted into the wind, laughing when the spray kissed their cheeks. To them, it felt like touching something celestial, what starlight might feel like, if it could be caught and held in the palm of a hand. These were moments without audience or grand design, yet they carried a strange permanence, crystallizing in the hearts of those who lived them. Decades later, the details would blur the exact shade of the sea. The precise words spoken, but the feeling would remain untarnished, the knowledge that for a fleeting stretch of days, life had intersected with something larger, finer, and altogether extraordinary, and that this great ship had been the stage upon which those private truths took root. They were fragments, isolated beads of experience, small enough to slip through the fingers if taken alone. But together they formed a necklace of memories so vivid that it would outlast the voyage, the ship, and even the years themselves. Each moment, whether a glance exchanged over a card table in the late glow of evening lamps, or the slow wander of footsteps along a frost-dusted deck at dawn, carried its own particular light. When the journey ended, these memories would scatter with their owners across ports, countries, and continents, carried in satchels and suitcases, not as objects, but as stories told in kitchens, in parlors, at bedsides. They would be recounted to friends who leaned in close to listen. Two children whose eyes widened at the thought of such a ship. Two strangers met by chance on trains or in markets. The details shifting slightly with each retelling. but always holding the same heartbeat of truth. In these stories, the Titanic would not be described in the language of tonnage or engineering, but in the human textures that truly defined her: the smell of fresh bread drifting from unseen galleys, the deep comfort of a bed turned down in silence, the sound of the Atlantic whispering against steel while one stood alone at the rail. Over time, these recollections would braid themselves into the larger fabric of her legend, not as the cold facts of history, but as the living pulse of memory, proof that her legacy had been born not only in what she was, but in what she left behind inside those who had walked her decks. Without fanfare, without any deliberate shaping by those aboard, the Titanic's legacy was crystallizing in that delicate, unmeasurable space between routine and wonder, a place where the smallest gestures could become eternal. It lived in the laughter around a card table that carried on long after the final hand was dealt, the sound threading into the ship's very timbers, as if the oak and steel themselves could remember. It was in the slow, deliberate pause of a man at dawn, standing alone at the rail, while the cold wind teased through his hair, his eyes tracing the unbroken seam where ocean met sky, feeling a kinship with something as ancient and endless as the sea itself. It existed in the pride of a steward smoothing the last wrinkle from a tablecloth until it lay flawlessly still, aware perhaps without fully admitting it that this act was not merely service, but a contribution to something larger, something that would ripple outward into memory. In the galley's heat, it was in the quiet nod shared between two cooks after a particularly fine service, their satisfaction unspoken yet understood. In the creak of polished stairs under the polished shoes of a young couple returning from the promenade, it was in the way their fingertips brushed light, as the touch of salt sprayed without either breaking stride. These details were the invisible scaffolding of the ship's greatness, the moments that would cling in recollection long after the precise shape of her hull faded from the mind. They were proof that the Titanic's true strength was not only in her rivets and plates, but in the quiet, human-scale impressions she left in the lives she carried forward through the vast, unbroken water. For the passengers, the sense of being part of something rare and magnificent was not wrapped in the lofty language of history books or future retrospectives. It was woven instead into the intimate fabric of their daily moments, often too subtle for them to recognize in real time. They did not think of themselves as witnesses to an era's pinnacle, nor as actors stepping into a chapter that would echo through generations. They were simply living within the ship's steady embrace, breathing in the crisp salt air on the promenade, feeling the faint vibration of the engines through the soles of their shoes, watching the horizon unspool like an endless ribbon that promised something just beyond reach. The grandeur of the Titanic was not merely observed, it was inhaled, tasted, and carried in the bloodstream. A man in first class might believe the elegance of the grand staircase had been designed for his particular footsteps. A family in second class might feel that the warm glow of the dining saloon belonged to them as surely as the lamps in their own homes. A child in third class might imagine the ship's towering funnels were guardians, watching over their dreams as they slept. Each person, in their own quiet way, claimed a piece of Her Majesty, believing without saying it that the ship's greatness was, for these days, theirs alone. And in that belief, they unknowingly bound themselves to her story, just as surely as she carried them forward over the patient, moonlit swells of the Atlantic. And yet, somewhere deep in the unspoken heart of the voyage, between the measured beats of the engines and the hushed sweep of waves along the hull, there was an intangible awareness that the Titanic was carrying not only her passengers toward a geographical destination, but herself toward a point beyond the known map, into a realm shaped as much by imagination as by steel and rivets. She was more than her tonnage, her decks. Her cabin she was already a living idea, a symbol that belonged to the world as much as to those aboard her. In the stillness of a moonlit night when the horizon blurred into the black silk of the sea, she seemed less like a ship moving through water and more like a luminous thread being stitched into the fabric of time itself. Every conversation held in her lounges, every step taken along her rails, every letter written under her lamps, became part of an unfolding legacy and invisible chronicle that no one could see in its entirety yet, but which would outlive the voyage itself. In that sense, the Titanic was not simply en route to New York. She was sailing toward a place no chart could capture, toward the rare and dangerous realm of the unforgettable, where myth begins not after an ending, but in the quiet certainty that the present moment will never fade. Time at sea has a strange quality, does not simply pass, folds itself into layers, each moment already tinged with the weight of its own remembrance. Even while the Titanic continued her steady westward progress, an invisible work was already underway. The present was becoming the past in real time, and each hour seemed to know it would soon be recalled. There was a softness to the way sounds carried along the decks, a richness to the way light fell across polished wood, a hushed intimacy in the air at night. As though the ship herself understood, she was being carefully recorded in the minds of all aboard. The long echo of a laugh in the distance, the measured clink of a teacup meeting its saucer, the quiet creak of the hull adjusting to the swell, these were not just experiences. They were seeds of memory, settling into place with the same inevitability as the tide. In the refined calm of first class, these beginnings of memory took shape in stolen instants between the ship's ordered rhythms. A gentleman might find himself alone at the rail, watching the horizon dissolve into a cool mist that blurred sea and sky into one endless expanse. The scent of salt lingered faintly on his gloves, the wind pressing against his coat. And though he might not have thought of it in those terms, some part of him knew that this precise meeting of air, light, and water would never come again. A lady in the reading room, her book open but unread in her lap, might listen to the low hum of conversation, the rustle of pages, the faraway murmur of the sea through the walls, feeling the moment seep quietly into her bones. These were not grand or dramatic events. They were delicate, almost fragile recognitions, the kind that are noticed only by those willing to pause long enough to feel them. In second class, memory was being laid down in patterns so gentle they could be mistaken for habit. Each morning, the sunlight streamed through tall windows, spilling across white tablecloths in neat rectangles. The smell of coffee mingled with the faint tang of the ocean that slipped in whenever a door was opened. Passengers sat a little longer over their meals than they might have at home, speaking in softer tones, as if aware that to raise one's voice too much might break the fragile perfection of the hour. On deck, they stood at the rail and watched the changing moods of the ocean, its surface shifting from glassy calm to a patchwork of silver ripples. Each hour a new painting hung in the same endless frame. Parents stored away the sound of their children's footsteps racing across the planks, the way their laughter was snatched up and carried off by the wind. In third class, the work of memory happened in the warm current of human closeness. Days unfolded with a rhythm all their own, where the smallest moments took on a weight that no one realized at the time. Mornings began with a slow stirring, the shuffle of feet on the wooden floor, the low creak of bunks as people rose, the mingled aromas of strong tea, bread, and the faint briny breath of the ocean drifting in from the upper decks. Stepping outside into the open air was like stepping into another world. The wind would rush at you, playful and insistent, carrying the smell of salt and something colder, deeper, almost metallic. People gathered at the rail, shoulders brushing, faces turned toward the horizon. They might not speak much or at all, yet there was a silent bond in their shared gaze at that endless line where sky and water met. Later, below decks, these images became the night's conversation, the shape of the waves, the sunlight's glint, the strange sense that the ocean was alive and watching them in return. Music would start as the day cooled, and the memories would mingle with the sound of the fiddle and the tap of boots, until it was impossible to know where one ended and the other began. In the bowels of the ship, in the unseen arteries that kept her alive, memory was something gathered in rare, quiet pockets of time. The crew lived their days and nights to the rhythm of duty, yet every so often, a moment would rise above the noise and heat, lodging itself in the mind. A steward, having completed his rounds, might pause at the threshold of an empty stateroom, taking in the way sunlight poured through the porthole, glancing off polished brass and dancing across the neatly made bed. It was a fleeting stillness, broken a heartbeat later by the distant call of another task, but it would remain with him. On the bridge, an officer would stand motionless for a few seconds after logging his report, gazing at the horizon not for signs of land or hazard, but simply to take in the sight of the ocean stretched flat and shimmering, as though the entire world had been reduced to two pure, unbroken elements, water and light. Far below, in the glowing furnace heat of the engine room, a stoker would lean on his shovel between feedings, sweat running into his eyes, feeling the deep, steady vibration of the ship travel through his boots and up into his bones, as if he could sense her very heartbeat through the steel. These instants, so small compared to the long hours, were quietly claimed, tucked away like coins in a hidden pocket. The Titanic herself seemed to be a keeper of these impressions, an unspoken archivist of human presence. Her wooden decks, scrubbed each morning until they gleamed, carried the soft indentation of countless footsteps, each one a story in motion. Though the marks would vanish under bristle and water, the memory of the step would linger in the mind of the one who took it. Lounges carried scents that changed with the hours, the fresh sharpness of morning tea, the faint perfume of a lady's passing, the heavier note of cigars in the late evening. In the grand staircase, light spilled down through the glass dome in shifting patterns, turning the white walls into canvases of gold, cream, and shadow. Even the walls themselves seemed to hold echoes, the faint ghost of a laugh. The last notes of a song played long after midnight, the subtle vibration of conversation. Passing a polished glass panel could briefly capture a face or gesture, preserving it for an instant before returning the reflection to the sea beyond. Some of the most lasting memories were born of moments so light they might have been overlooked. Two passengers brushing past each other in a narrow corridor might share a glance that meant nothing at the time. Yet years later, they could recall the exact tone of the light in that space, the muffled sound of footsteps on the carpet, the way the air smelled faintly of varnished wood and ocean salt. A sleepless soul, wandering to the open deck in the hour before dawn, might find the world transformed into something otherworldly. The ship a moving island of light surrounded by an ocean of black glass. The air cool and damp against the skin, the stars above so sharp and brilliant they seemed suspended in the very breath of night. That passenger might lean against the rail and feel the ship's slow rise and fall beneath them, the quiet rush of water past her hull, and take it deep into memory without even realizing it. The sea, endless and alive, became an unspoken accomplice in this work of memory. In the morning, it might stretch away in ripples of pale green that caught the light like hammered metal. By afternoon, it could deepen into a blue so profound it seemed to have no bottom. At night, the ship's wake appeared as a luminous path, curling white against the darkness, dissolving into foam and then into nothing at all. Passengers would stand by the rail to watch it fade, speaking softly or not at all, as if understanding instinctively that they were watching time made visible a trail of moments left behind, untraceable once lost to the distance. The sky answered the sea's changes with its own shifting canvas. Dawn arrived as a slow burn, a faint warmth blooming at the edge of the world before spilling gold and rose across the water. Midday brought a light so sharp and clear it seemed to etch every line of the ship into perfect relief, from the curves of her hull to the rivets in her plates. Dusk softened everything, pulling the day down into purples and deep blues until the first stars appeared. Faint at first and then all at once, crowding the heavens until it felt as though the ship were moving not on water, but through a river of light. Each transformation was its own chapter, and those who stood still long enough to watch felt themselves become part of something that moved beyond hours and minutes. Meals, too, became lodestones of the voyage moments that grounded the passengers amid the constant movement. In first class, the dining saloon seemed to exist outside of time. Chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, and the stewards moved in a dance of quiet precision, their footsteps hushed against the carpet. In second class, the comfort of warm bread and the familiar fragrance of tea were heightened by the unexpected grace of fine china and attentive service. In third class, there was a warmth in the simplicity. Bowls of thick stew after a day in the wind, bread shared between friends, the hum of conversation in many languages blending into a single human music. These meals were more than sustenance. They were markers of belonging, memories to be returned too long after the crossing was done. There were moments when preserving a memory was not an act, but a stillness. A passenger might remain at a porthole for long minutes, after their eyes had ceased to register change, absorbing the way the foam traced temporary shapes on the surface before dissolving. Another might walk the length of the deck with one hand resting on the smooth varnish of the rail, feeling its faint warmth from the sun, its resistance under the palm, the occasional cool kiss of wind where the wood fell into shadow. These touches, these patient glances, were unspoken promises, vows made silently to hold on to the moment when the voyage became part of them. Conversations themselves carried the seeds of memory, planted with each word shared. People spoke of their homes, the streets they knew, the faces they missed. They painted with words the lives they had left behind and the dreams waiting at journey's end. The listener took those words into themselves, carrying them away as if they were treasures, so that the memory of another person's hope or longing became a permanent passenger in their own mind. The rhythm of the ship's life beat steadily beneath it, all the call to meals, the promenade along the rail, the gatherings in lounges filled with music or quiet talk. Every repeated pattern deepened the sense that this voyage was both familiar and rare, a thing unfolding within the safe boundaries of ritual, yet unlike anything that had come before or would come again. The constant turning of the engines was echoed in the constant turning of memory, storing each day not in isolation but as part of a greater whole. And so, time enveloped the Titanic with the same patience as the ocean around her. The present and the past wove themselves together until they could no longer be separated, each moment becoming a thread in a tapestry that none aboard could yet see in its entirety. But they sensed in some deep and quiet place that what they were living now would remain luminous long after the voyage had ended, bright fragments of light suspended in the endless night sky of memory. Long after the voyage had ended, long after the ship had slipped into the realm of history and legend, there were still those who carried her with them, not as an image in a book or a line in a news column, but as a living presence stitched into the fabric of their lives. These people did not need to close their eyes to return to her. The smallest of things could draw them back in an instant. The pale gold of early morning sunlight spilling across a floor might open a hidden door in the mind, revealing the sight of the Atlantic stretching away in unbroken shimmer beyond the rail. The faint scent of salt water on a breeze hundreds of miles inland could, for a heartbeat, become the wind rushing past the promenade deck, full of life and coolness. And when those moments came, unexpected and unannounced, the years in between seemed to melt away, leaving the listener standing once more on her steady decks, feeling the quiet, living heartbeat of the ship deep beneath their feet. For some, the echoes arrived in sounds that had no reason to belong to the present, yet when heard, carried the full weight of the past. A deep, resonant vibration in the walls of a modern building might suddenly become the muted thrum of the Titanic's great engines. That steady pulse felt not just in the ears, but in the bones. The sound of water rushing past the hull of a ferry or the side of a pier might, in an instant, transform into the music of her passage across the Atlantic. A hush both immense and intimate, and sometimes music itself would unlock the past, a lilting waltz drifting from a nearby room, so faint it seemed to come from another world. To draw forth the image of the grand saloon filled with warm lamplight, where couples turned gracefully in time with both melody and sea, the shadows swaying gently on polished wood floors. These sounds were like whispers from a distance. They came softly, stayed only briefly, and yet lingered in the heart long after the ears had let them go. Others found their memories carried through touch, for the hand remembers in ways the mind cannot. The feel of varnished wood beneath the palms, smooth yet faintly ridged with the grain, could recall the ship's railings, sun-warmed and solid, holding the passenger steady against the slow, magnificent roll of the sea. The cool, measured weight of fine silver in the fingers might become the table setting of a first-class meal, where white linen glowed softly under golden light and quiet conversation moved like a tide between courses. Even the tug of wind on a wool coat could bring the mind back to a night spent on the upper decks, where the air was cold enough to sting, yet so clean and filled with stars that one could almost forget to breathe. These sensations were not sought after, they arrived without permission, but when they did, they could stop a person in mid-step, as if the world itself had shifted to allow the past to brush against the present. Some echoes came in visions, startling in their precision and clarity. The mind would offer them up without warning. A woman leaning at the rail, her gloved hands resting lightly on the polished wood, her hat ribbon snapping in the wind. A child in a pale coat chasing a rubber ball across the deck, his laughter scattering like gulls startled into flight. The way sunlight, glancing off the restless water, spilled into a cabin through the portholes, scattering itself into shifting patches of silver on the ceiling. These visions lasted no more than seconds, but they were complete, no detail missing, no texture or shade of light forgotten. They were not memories recalled in the abstract. They were moments relived, as if the observer had been quietly lifted out of the present and placed, without warning, back on that moving world. There were echoes, too, and voices, though rarely in the form of complete sentences. Instead, they came as tones, inflections, and cadences that carried more of the person than the words themselves ever had. A warm chuckle, low and genuine, might rise unbidden in the mind, its owner long gone, yet suddenly close again. The gentle rise and fall of a language not one's own, overheard in a market, might blend into the remembered music of many voices mingling on the promenade deck, weaving a tapestry of sound that was as much the ship's identity as her nameplate. The crisp, clear announcement of a steward, half formal, half warm with routine familiarity, could suddenly echo down a corridor that no longer existed, but which felt utterly real in that moment. These fragments of voice were as haunting as they were comforting, for in them lived the essence of people who had once moved easily through those long, echoing spaces. Not every echo was soft or bathed in warmth. Some carried the sharp edge of shadow, reminders of how fragile even the grandest beauty can be. A sudden hush in the midst of a bustling street might stir an unease that felt older than the moment itself, echo of the way the ocean could fall into a strange, watchful stillness under certain skies. The smell of coal smoke drifting over a harbor might bring with it the knowledge of how quickly the future can change course. These moments were rarely welcome, and yet they were part of the truth, the full shape of memory which contains not only the glow of joy, but the flicker of loss. And even in their melancholy, these darker echoes bound the rememberer more firmly to the ship, for they spoke of her as she truly was, a place of life and beauty, yet also a fragile moment in time. There were echoes, too, in voices, though rarely did they arrive as entire sentences that could be neatly remembered and repeated. Instead, they emerged in fragments, in the subtle inflections and cadences that carried far more of the person than the words themselves ever had. A warm chuckle, low and unforced, might rise suddenly in the mind, so tangible that for a moment it seemed the speaker must be just behind the listener, ready to step into view. A certain turn of phrase overheard on a street corner could stir the memory of an old shipmate leaning against the rail, the wind tugging at his coat as he spoke. The gentle lilt of a language not one's own caught in passing at a market or on a train might dissolve into the remembered soundscape of the promenade deck, where dozens of tongues mingled like weaving threads in a great tapestry of life. Even the crisp, authoritative clarity of a steward's announcement, its edges softened by routine familiarity, could seem to echo down a corridor that existed now only in memory, each syllable ringing against polished paneling that no longer stood. These fragments of voice were haunting in their intimacy. They carried the essence of the people themselves, not as static recollections, but as living presences. In such moments, the distance between past and present collapsed entirely, and the listener felt, with a sudden and piercing certainty, that those who had once walked the Titanic's decks still moved quietly alongside them, speaking in tones that could never be mistaken, never truly forgotten. Not every echo was soft or bathed in the warm light of nostalgia. Some arrived edged with a shadow so fine it could slip into the mind before one knew it was there, carrying with them the sobering weight of impermanence. A sudden hush in the midst of a bustling street of silence that seemed to fall from nowhere might awaken the same uneasy stillness that had once settled over the ocean under certain ominous skies, when even the wind seemed to pause as if listening for something. The acrid temps of coal smoke drifting through the air in a harbor could summon an awareness of the ship's power and fragility all at once, reminding one how swiftly the future can shift its course, how icily the horizon can darken. Even the dimming of a room's light, when a cloud slid across the sun, might echo the way evening shadows had crept along the decks, stretching toward the bow with a quiet insistence that felt like a warning. These were not the echoes one sought. They came uninvited, bringing with them a tangle of memory and foreboding. But they were as honest a part of the ship's truth as the music, the laughter, or the golden glow of her lamps. For in their quiet, unsettling way, they spoke of the Titanic as she truly was, not a frozen image of beauty alone, but a living, finite thing, caught in the brief and fragile span between her creation and her end. Dreams were the one realm where the echoes could return whole and unbroken, free from the fractures and blurring that waking memory imposed. In sleep, the Titanic emerged in perfect clarity, as if the mind had stored her away in a place untouched by time's erosion. Her decks lay spotless beneath the soft wash of moonlight, each plank and railing rendered with a precision no photograph could hold. The brass gleamed as though freshly polished, catching and holding the warm glow of lamplight that spilled gently from open doorways. The air carried the mingled scents of salt, varnish, and distant flowers. And beneath it all, the deep, steady breath of her engines thrummed like the pulse of a living creature. One could walk her corridors again, the muffled hum of conversation behind closed stateroom doors. The faint clink of glassware in the dining saloon, the low creak of timber shifting softly to the sea's rhythm. The promenade stretched without end, the horizon forever receding ahead, the wind brushing the face with that same mingling of coolness and promise it had carried on the crossing. At the bow, the ship's wake unfurled in an endless ribbon of white, the moon's silver gaze painting it with a light so ethereal it seemed almost solid enough to touch. And then, inevitably, the waking came not sudden, but slow, like surfacing from deep, dark water. For a few moments the present would feel paper-thin, fragile as mist, as though with one more breath or one more step, the dreamer could slip through it and find themselves once again aboard, the voyage not yet ended, the night still calm, and the future still unwritten. Even those who had never set foot upon her decks found themselves caught in some quiet and inexplicable way by the lingering reach of her voice. It traveled not only through books and photographs, but through the living chain of memory passed from lips that had seen her, to ears that could only imagine. A child sitting cross-legged on a worn rug might listen to a grandparent's voice soften and slow as they spoke of the crossing, each word carrying the faint salt scent of far-off seas and the glow of a world now gone. The child might not fully understand the weight in the pauses, the way certain names were spoken with care, but something would take root, a yearning for the wide-open horizon, for the hush of the ocean under a starlit sky. A small cafe on a rainy afternoon, a stranger might overhear her name mentioned in passing. Nothing more than a fragment in another table's conversation, yet feel the air subtly shift, as though an unseen door had creaked open. The syllables themselves seemed to hold a kind of gravity, pulling the listener toward images they had never truly owned. Towering decks, glittering chandeliers, and the sound of water forever folding against a steel hull. Memory, after all, is not a thing that remains locked in one life. It slips easily between minds, weaving itself into places and people who were never there, ensuring that the ship's presence endures not as a static tale, but as a living thread in the fabric of human imagining. The echoes often came in the most unassuming of moments, arriving not with fanfare but with the quiet certainty of a tide slipping over sand. They were never summoned on purpose. They emerged from the present as if the world had momentarily forgotten its boundaries. A shaft of sunlight falling across an old wooden floor could, in the blink of an eye, dissolve into the afternoon glow that once stretched across the Titanic's promenade, where the boards seemed to hum softly underfoot with the deep, steady heartbeat of her engines. The close, almost secret air of a narrow, wood-paneled hallway might suddenly become the cool, measured stillness of her interior passages, where the faint mingling of scents, fresh polish, salt carried in from the deck, and a trace of cut flowers seemed to belong entirely to her. Even the low murmur of voices in another room, indistinct but warm, could bring back the sensation of walking past closed cabin doors, catching brief threads of laughter or music, knowing that life was unfolding in countless small and separate worlds behind each one. In these moments, time lost its linear shape, and the person stood without movement, without effort into realities at once. The solid, immediate now, and the shimmering, unbroken memory of a ship still cutting her path through a boundless sea. For those who had loved the voyage the days before the end, the echoes were more than just fragments of memory. They were gifts that returned like tides, washing gently over the mind and leaving behind a renewed sense of wonder. Each time they came, they did more than recall the ship's beauty. They restored the feeling that had filled the air during her departure, that quiet, almost electric awareness that something extraordinary was beginning. Standing on her decks in those early days had been like existing within a moment carved out of time itself, suspended delicately between what had been left behind and what lay unseen ahead. The horizon had seemed infinite, the sea both a challenge and a promise. And every breath had carried the taste of possibility. When the echoes returned, they did not merely replay images, they brought back that same undercurrent of anticipation. The same subtle tremor in the chest at the thought of open water and unbroken sky. It was as if for a few precious moments the soul could step back into that suspended hour before fate had taken its turn, and stand once again at the rail with the wind in the face, watching the ocean open endlessly before the bow. For others, the echoes were far more complex, woven from threads of light and shadow so tightly bound that neither could be separated from the other. The sweetness of remembrance was always braided with a quiet ache, a knowledge that the beauty they recalled existed only because it had been fleeting. The scent of freshly varnished wood, for instance, might bring with it the golden gleam of the grand staircase, its balustrades curving in perfect symmetry beneath the glow of the dome. Above, but along with that vision, came the memory of a moment when the music had ceased and the air had grown still, as though the ship herself had paused to listen for something beyond the reach of human hearing. The cry of gulls circling over a harbor could stir the same tangle of emotions. The exhilaration of a vessel easing away from the quay, ropes coiling on deck, the water widening between ship and shore, and, yet, carried in the very same sound, the muted ache of knowing that such departures also mark the beginning of absences that may never be mended. This mingling of light and shadow gave the memories their weight, their permanence, their truth. They did not live as fragile relics locked in the past. They breathed and shifted with the present, capable of touching the heart as keenly now as they had on that first morning at sea. There were moments when the echoes gathered not in solitude, but in the shared warmth of familiar company, when those who had once walked the same decks found themselves together again. Perhaps by design, perhaps by the gentle pull of fate. At first, the conversation would be casual, touching on the weather, on daily matters, on the comfortable trivia of the present. Yet, inevitably, someone's words would stray toward the voyage, and with that single thread pulled loose, the tapestry would begin to unravel into memory. A small, almost forgotten incident, a misplaced hat. A song half sung in the smoking room. Peculiar turn of phrase from a steward would spark a chorus of recollections, each fragment unlocking another. Laughter would rise easily at first, the kind that needs no explanation among those who shared the same horizon. Then, just as suddenly, a hush would descend, not from discomfort, but from the quiet reverence of a moment reclaimed. In those silences, it was as though the Titanic herself had stepped invisibly into the room, her presence assembling from the words and the pauses alike. Between them, piece by remembered piece, she would take shape again, not as a cold artifact of history, but as she had truly been, warm with life, alive with voices, moving steadily across a boundless sea beneath a sky that seemed to promise forever. And so, the great ship drifts onward, not through the cold waters of the North Atlantic, but through the vast, uncharted tides of memory, her passage marked not by waves or wind, but by the quiet, persistent beat of human recollection. As she sails in the mind's eye now, her decks gleaming in an eternal sunlight that never fades, her railings warm beneath a touch that exists only in dreams, her silhouette cut clean and perfect against a horizon that never draws nearer. In this voyage, there is no clock to mark the hours, no destination to anchor the heart, no nightfall to close the die, only the steady unfolding of moments that belong equally to the present and the past. Those who knew her walk these decks still, moving through corridors that have long since dissolved into the deep, their laughter, voices, and footfalls blending with the remembered rhythm of the sea that no longer holds her. The ocean itself has not forgotten. Beneath its endless surface, far below the restless dance of wind and wave, the water keeps its own quiet counsel. It remembers the shape of her passing, the precise way her bow once cut through its depths with the grace of something born to the sea. In the roar of storms, there is sometimes a note in the wind that seems to shape her name. In moments of absolute calm, there is a stillness that feels like the pause before she rounds the curve of the earth. The sea carries her story not as a burden, but as a companion woven into its own endless song, told in tides and currents to shores that will never see her again. For those who listen closely, the Titanic is never far away. She returns in the curl and fall of a wave, in the glint of sun flashing across moving water, in the slow, steady rhythm of footsteps on a wooden pier. She is there in the warm hush of a dining room, where low voices mingle with the faint clink of silver on china. She is there in the faintest trace of coal smoke drifting on a harbor breeze. And she is there, too, in the spaces between sounds and silences that feel too full to be empty, as though they hold something just beyond reach, something that waits for the right kind of listening to reveal itself. The passage of years does not dim her light. If anything, it sharpens it, turning her from one story into 1,000. From a single journey into an endless crossing that flows through generations. Each person who remembers her, whether through their own eyes or through the voice of another, adds another strand to the vast web of her existence. Together these strands weave something unbreakable, a vessel not of steel and rivets, but of memory, emotion, and time, carrying the truth that beauty once touched does not vanish, but becomes part of the one who holds it. Perhaps that is why she endures, not because of the way her story ended, but because of the way she lived in those days before. The Titanic is not solely the measure of her fate. She is the gleam of morning light unbroken on an open sea, the murmur of voices spilling gently into a carpeted corridor, the feel of the deck shifting subtly beneath your step. She is the salt on your lips from a sudden gust, the hum of engines far below, the promise of a horizon so vast it seems to stretch into eternity. Somewhere in the unbroken expanse of night, far beyond the reach of any shore, she still moves forward. The sea parts before her. The stars open their patient, silent paths overhead. The wind carries that same mingled scent of salt and steel and varnished wood, and the ship answers with the deep, unhurried beat of her heart. And if you close your eyes, close them fully, with the part of yourself that belongs not to the present, but to the vast ocean of memory, you may hear her even now. The Titanic, forever crossing, forever lit against the dark, forever alive in the whispers of the world.